They were the hunters of the deep, the silent killers of the sea, whose presence could turn the vastness of the ocean into a battlefield of fear. Submarine warfare in World War II was unlike anything seen before, a deadly contest fought beneath the waves where men lived in steel tubes, cut off from the world above, and struck with torpedoes that could shatter mighty warships in seconds. From the U-boats of Nazi Germany prowling the Atlantic in ruthless wolfpacks, to American submarines strangling Japan's lifelines in the Pacific, the war beneath the sea was both invisible and devastating. Life aboard these submarines was claustrophobic and dangerous, with stale air, constant tension, and the knowledge that one depth charge could end everything in an instant. In the Atlantic, convoys of merchant ships carried food, fuel, and weapons vital to Britain's survival, while U-boats stalked them relentlessly, sending thousands of sailors to watery graves. In the Pacific, American subs choked Japan's empire by sinking tankers, freighters, and even warships, reducing an island nation to starvation and collapse. Technology evolved at a furious pace. Sonar, radar, torpedo improvements, and code-breaking all shaped the undersea struggle. Submarine crews became ghosts in the ocean, unseen but always feared, living with courage, exhaustion, and the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. By the war's end, submarine warfare had claimed millions of tons of shipping, altered the course of campaigns, and left behind stories of incredible bravery, terror, and sacrifice. This is the story of the hunters and the hunted, of machines built for stealth and destruction, and of the men who lived and died in the silence of the deep. So join me now as we dive into the entire story of submarine warfare in World War II, uncovering the strategy, the battles, and the human experiences that made it one of the deadliest arenas of the war. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you tuning in from, and what time of day is it for you right now, as you listen to this story of silent killers beneath the sea? The story of submarine warfare in the Second World War cannot be told without first returning to the uneasy waters of the early 20th century. The submarine was a weapon born in secrecy, mistrust, and experimentation, dismissed by many admirals as a dishonorable tool of cowards. Yet even in its infancy, it carried the promise of transforming the seas into battlefields where no ship could ever truly feel safe. During World War I, German U-boats terrorized the Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels with ruthless efficiency and starving Britain of supplies. The infamous sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, shocked the world and cemented the submarine's reputation as a weapon that blurred the lines between combatant and non-combatant. By the end of that war, U-boats had sunk more than 5,000 ships, inflicting losses the Allies could scarcely afford. But for Germany, the victory came at terrible cost, with nearly 200 submarines lost and tens of thousands of sailors entombed beneath the waves. These grim lessons shaped the doctrine of every major navy during the interwar years. The submarine was no longer an experimental vessel. It was a silent killer with proven power. In the 1920s, navies across the world faced a dilemma: how to integrate this dangerous new weapon into fleets still dominated by battleships and cruisers. The United States Navy saw its submarines as scouts, tasked with shadowing enemy battle fleets and reporting their movements. Britain, scarred by U-boat losses in the First World War, maintained a defensive doctrine, using submarines as guardians of its empire's trade routes. France built large ocean-going submarines capable of operating from Indochina to the Mediterranean, envisioning them as tools of deterrence against Italy and Germany alike. Italy, with its long Mediterranean coastline, invested heavily in submarine flotillas designed to disrupt enemy shipping. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued submarine warfare with almost religious zeal, constructing some of the largest pre-war fleets in anticipation of future conflict. Each nation viewed the submarine differently, but all recognized its potential to alter naval warfare forever. The oceans of the 1930s were already alive with these machines, even if the world had not yet seen the scale of destruction they would unleash. The silent service was preparing for its deadliest chapter. Germany's path back to submarine warfare was more complex, defined by the strictures of defeat and the constraints of international treaties. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade Germany from building or owning submarines, a clause meant to strip away the weapon that had nearly starved Britain into submission. Yet the German naval staff, unwilling to abandon their most potent weapon, found ways to continue research in secret. Under cover of commercial ventures and collaboration with other nations, German engineers experimented with designs that could one day be resurrected. By the early 1930s, with Hitler's rise to power and the rejection of treaty obligations, the veil of secrecy was lifted. The Kriegsmarine began constructing new U-boats, starting with smaller coastal models before advancing to the Type 7 and Type 9 designs that would dominate the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Donitz, a veteran of U-boat service in the First World War, became the architect of this reborn fleet. He envisioned not lone hunters, but coordinated wolfpacks, striking convoys with precision and overwhelming force. For Germany, submarines were not just tools of war, they were symbols of defiance against a world order imposed by victors. The development of submarine technology during the interwar years was marked by relentless innovation and bitter lessons. Diesel engines, pioneered in the First World War, became standard, providing greater range and endurance. Batteries were improved, though submarines still remained vulnerable when forced to surface to recharge. Periscopes became more sophisticated, allowing longer observation with less exposure to enemy detection. Torpedoes grew in power and accuracy, though many navies struggled with technical flaws that would haunt them in the opening years of World War II. Pressure hulls were strengthened, enabling submarines to dive deeper and survive greater stresses under attack. Radio equipment expanded communication, allowing commanders to coordinate fleets spread across oceans. Yet for all these advances, submarines remained fragile, their crews living in steel coffins, where one depth charge could mean instant annihilation. Submariners accepted this risk with grim resolve, knowing they belonged to the most dangerous branch of naval service. The interwar years gave them better tools, but no illusions of safety. The ocean remained both ally and executioner. Life aboard these early submarines was grueling, defined by claustrophobia, stench, and constant danger. Crews lived in cramped quarters, with bunks shared between shifts in a practice known as hot bunking. The air grew foul quickly, thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and unwashed bodies, making every breath a reminder of confinement. Food was stored wherever space could be found, from canned goods wedged beneath bunks to sausages strung above torpedoes. Fresh water was rationed carefully, often reserved for engines and batteries rather than men. Silence was enforced during dives, every sound a potential beacon to patrolling destroyers above. Submariners spoke of the oppressive heat in tropical waters and the bone-chilling cold of the Atlantic, both endured without relief. The psychological strain was immense, with weeks spent beneath the waves and death always just a leak away. Yet the men of the silent service developed camaraderie, unlike any other branch of the Navy. They lived and fought together in darkness, trusting each other absolutely. Their world was a steel tube suspended between life and oblivion. The interwar period was also defined by international efforts to control submarine warfare, though these efforts often failed. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaty of 1930 attempted to regulate not only battleships and cruisers, but also submarines. Nations agreed to limit tonnage, establish rules for attacking merchant ships, and reaffirm the need to spare civilian lives. But these rules often collapsed under the weight of reality, as submarine warfare inherently blurred the line between combatant and civilian. Admirals argued over whether submarines could be used against commerce at all, while strategists quietly prepared to unleash them against enemy trade. The treaties slowed construction but never halted it, and by the mid-1930s, rearmament was accelerating worldwide. Germany discarded restrictions entirely, while Japan walked away from treaty obligations to pursue its own naval dominance. The hope of controlling submarines through diplomacy proved futile. The world was preparing for another war, and the silent killers were sharpening their teeth. Japan, too, invested heavily in submarines during the interwar years, though its doctrine diverged sharply from Germany's. Rather than commerce raiding, the Imperial Japanese Navy envisioned submarines as fleet scouts, designed to shadow enemy warships and ambush them in decisive battles. Japanese engineers produced some of the largest and most advanced submarines in the world, including vessels capable of carrying seaplanes for reconnaissance. Their I-class submarines boasted long range, enabling them to patrol across the Pacific and even into Indian Ocean waters. Yet the focus on fleet actions meant Japan never fully embraced the potential of strangling enemy supply lines. When war came, this doctrinal choice would shape their strategy, leaving American shipping routes largely untouched until it was too late. Nevertheless, Japan entered the Second World War with one of the most impressive submarine fleets afloat. Their submariners trained with intensity, committed to the same code of sacrifice that defined their surface fleet. The seeds of both opportunity and failure were sown in these interwar decisions, and they would bear fruit in the years to come. By 1939, as Europe slid once again toward conflict, submarines stood ready as instruments of both fear and opportunity. Germany prepared to unleash its rebuilt U-boat arm against Britain's lifelines, determined to repeat and surpass its World War I campaign. Britain and France braced for another submarine onslaught, investing in escorts, sonar, and convoy systems. The United States maintained neutrality, but quietly expanded its submarine program, anticipating that it would one day be drawn into global war. Japan polished its doctrine of fleet scouting, unaware that the decisive battles it envisioned would rarely materialize. The Soviet Union, though isolated politically, maintained vast submarine fleets in the Baltic and Pacific, ready to defend its interests. Every ocean hid steel predators, waiting for the signal to strike. The legacy of World War I hung over them like a shadow, reminding admirals of both the potential and the peril of these machines. The world had not yet heard the full roar of submarine warfare, but in 1939, the silence before the storm was already deafening. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the world once again turned to the oceans, where silent hunters prepared to strike. The Kriegsmarine was dwarfed by the mighty Royal Navy, lacking battleships and carriers in meaningful numbers, but it held a weapon that could even the odds. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, knew that his fleet of submarines was Germany's best chance to strangle Britain's lifeline. The island nation depended on imports of food, fuel, and raw materials to survive, with nearly 70% of its supplies carried by merchant shipping. Donitz believed that by sinking 700,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would be starved into submission. Yet when war began, Germany had only 57 operational U-boats, of which fewer than half could operate in the Atlantic at once. Many were small coastal models unsuited for long-range patrols, leaving only a handful of Type 7 and Type 9 boats to carry the burden. Still, these boats carried highly trained crews, men who embraced their deadly mission with iron resolve. The war at sea would begin not with grand fleets clashing, but with shadows moving beneath the waves. The U-boats were ready. The first weeks of the conflict demonstrated both the potential and the controversy of submarine warfare. On September 3, 1939, just hours after Britain declared war, U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 120 civilians were killed, sparking outrage and accusations of unrestricted submarine warfare on the very first day. Berlin quickly tried to cover up the incident, blaming Britain for propaganda, but the damage was done. The sinking reminded the world of World War I, when U-boats had earned infamy for targeting civilian vessels. Hitler, still hopeful for a negotiated peace with Britain, ordered restrictions on submarine attacks. Captains were instructed to follow prize rules, warning merchant ships before sinking them when possible. But the Atlantic was vast, and war at sea had a momentum of its own. As convoys formed and shipping lanes grew crowded, such restrictions became increasingly impractical. The submarine commanders, veterans of the silent service, knew their mission would demand ruthlessness, and beneath the waves, ruthlessness was survival. The geography of the Atlantic shaped the early U-boat war as much as strategy. Britain's survival depended on convoys crossing from North America, carrying grain, oil, and steel through treacherous waters. The western approaches, those seas west of Ireland and the English Channel, became the hunting grounds of the U-boats. Narrow straits, unpredictable weather, and constant fog gave submarines perfect cover to stalk their prey. Merchantmen, often lightly armed or completely defenseless, were easy targets for skilled torpedo attacks. Convoys had not yet been fully organized, leaving many ships sailing independently, isolated and vulnerable. For U-boat commanders, this was the first happy time, a period when tonnage sank rapidly and morale soared. Ships burned on the horizon, night after night, their crews scrambling for lifeboats as the submarines slipped away unseen. British newspapers filled with grim headlines of sunken freighters, insurance rates skyrocketed, and the public felt the creeping pressure of blockade. The war at sea had begun in earnest, and Germany was determined to squeeze the island into desperation. At the center of this campaign stood Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man whose vision defined the U-boat war. A former U-boat commander himself, Dönitz carried scars from World War I, including years spent as a British prisoner of war. He emerged from that experience convinced that Germany's only hope against Britain's naval superiority lay in submarine warfare. His doctrine of Wolfpack tactics aimed to coordinate multiple U-boats against convoys, overwhelming escorts, and sinking dozens of ships in a single night. Yet in 1939, Germany lacked both the numbers and the communications technology to make this vision fully operational. Most U-boats hunted alone, relying on stealth and surprise rather than coordination. Still, Dönitz drilled his crews in aggressive tactics, demanding precision, discipline, and absolute loyalty. His men admired him for his dedication, calling him the father of the U-boat arm. He never promised them safety, only honor and effectiveness in their deadly mission. Under his leadership, the submarines became Germany's sharpest weapon against Britain's sea lifeline, and with each sinking, his vision seemed justified. The men who crewed these early U-boats were among the most elite in the German armed forces. Recruited for their technical skill and psychological resilience, they endured months of rigorous training before ever setting foot on a war patrol. Life aboard was harsh, space was scarce, temperatures fluctuated wildly, and silence was often mandatory for survival. Sailors slept in shifts, their bunks wedged between torpedoes and machinery, while the smell of diesel, sweat, and stale food filled the air. Every dive pressed their ears and lungs with crushing pressure, reminding them of the thin steel barrier that separated life from the sea. Depth charges, when they came, shook the hull with terrifying force, turning the submarine into a steel coffin tossed in darkness. Yet camaraderie was strong, with officers and enlisted men sharing the same dangers and hardships without distinction. Victories at sea lifted spirits, but every patrol carried the shadow of death, with no guarantee of return. Submariners knew they served in the most dangerous branch of the Kriegsmarine, and they accepted that honor with grim pride. For Britain, the U-boat threat represented a nightmare that seemed to repeat history. Memories of the World War I blockade were still fresh, and the nation understood its vulnerability as an island power. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, even before becoming leader, had warned that the U-boat peril could strangle the empire. British strategists scrambled to deploy escorts, organize convoys, and expand sonar detection. But in the autumn of 1939, the defenses were thin. Destroyers were spread too thin to cover every route, and air patrols could not reach the mid-Atlantic gap. Merchant sailors, many civilians conscripted into wartime service, braved the seas with little more than lifeboats and luck to protect them. As ships went down, questions arose in Parliament about how long the nation could sustain such losses. Newspapers reported tonnage sunk with alarming regularity, fueling fear that Britain might starve before the war turned in its favor. The Battle of the Atlantic was not yet named, but it had already begun, and it was the U-boats that dictated its early tempo. The weapons of the U-boats were simple but devastating in their effect. Torpedoes carried warheads packed with explosives capable of splitting a freighter in half. U-boats often fired spreads of torpedoes to ensure at least one hit, a tactic that proved deadly against convoys. Deck guns mounted on the submarines allowed them to finish off damaged vessels or conserve torpedoes against smaller targets. In the early months, when merchant ships lacked heavy escorts, these guns were used frequently, with U-boats surfacing boldly to shell defenseless ships. The psychological effect of such attacks was immense, as sailors watched explosions tear through steel hulls without ever seeing their attacker. Survivors floated in lifeboats, clinging to hope as submarines disappeared into the night. For the Germans, every successful patrol was measured in tonnage sunk, reported back to Donitz with clinical precision. For the Allies, each loss represented both material and morale, eroding Britain's confidence in its ability to endure. The sea had become a battlefield where the enemy was invisible, and fear itself was part of the weapon. By the close of 1939, the U-boat threat had already reshaped the war at sea. Dozens of ships lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, and Britain's lifelines trembled under the strain. Yet the Germans had only scratched the surface of what Donitz envisioned for his submarine fleet. The Wolfpacks he dreamed of were still to come, waiting for technology and numbers to make them reality. Britain, meanwhile, recognized that survival depended on solving the U-boat menace, whatever the cost. Convoys were expanded, escort production accelerated, and scientists pushed the limits of sonar and radar. The stage was set for a vast, grinding struggle across the oceans, where every ship lost or saved might alter the course of the war. In this opening chapter of submarine warfare, Germany had shown its hand. The U-boat would be its deadliest weapon. For Britain, the question was not if the threat could be defeated, but how long the nation could endure. The silent war beneath the waves had begun, and it would define the Second World War at sea. By the winter of 1939, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard of steel and fire. its waves carrying the wreckage of Britain's lifeline. German U-boats prowled the sea lanes, their commanders turning the ocean into a battlefield where no merchantman was safe. Each night, flares illuminated the horizon as tankers and freighters erupted into flames, their crews scrambling for lifeboats under a sky filled with smoke. The Royal Navy, stretched thin across global commitments, struggled to provide escorts for the endless stream of convoys. Destroyers raced from one emergency to the next, depth charges rolling into the sea as they hunted shadows that always seemed to slip away. Britain's survival depended on 70 million tons of imports each year, and within months the tonnage losses became alarming. By December 1939, over 100 merchant ships had been sunk, and morale at home began to crack under the pressure of scarcity. Civilians saw rationing tighten, with sugar, butter, and meat ration cards becoming symbols of sacrifice. Newspapers carried grim headlines of sinkings, while photographs of survivors in lifeboats brought the war uncomfortably close. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun not with fleets, but with hunger. The U-boats' early victories came from a mix of boldness and Britain's unpreparedness. Many merchant ships still sailed independently, ignoring the lessons of the First World War when convoys had saved countless lives. German commanders like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke turned the ocean into their hunting ground, names that would soon become legendary in the silent service. Prien achieved instant fame in October 1939 when his U-47 penetrated Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's supposedly impregnable anchorage. With cold precision, he sank the battleship Royal Oak, killing more than 800 sailors in their bunks and humiliating the British Admiralty. Kretschmer, nicknamed Silent Otto, perfected surface night attacks, slipping into convoys and striking at close range with devastating effect. Schepke, equally daring, became a master of ambush, teaching his crews to exploit gaps in convoy defenses. These commanders embodied Donitz's vision, each sinking measured not just in tonnage but in psychological impact. The world took notice as U-boats proved they could challenge the might of the Royal Navy. For Britain, the nightmare had returned. The North Atlantic itself became a weapon, a vast stage of storms, fog, and treacherous seas that favored the hunter more than the hunted. Winter gales battered convoys, scattering merchantmen, and forcing escorts to break formation. Icebergs drifted silently in northern waters, complicating navigation and creating hazards that submarines used as cover. In these conditions, the U-boats thrived, surfacing to attack when visibility dropped to near zero. Convoys stretched over miles of ocean, their ships vulnerable at the flanks and rear, where escorts could not be everywhere at once. Submarine commanders studied shipping routes carefully, intercepting convoys as they funneled through choke points near Ireland and the Bay of Biscay. Merchant captains, many civilians untrained for combat, sailed through nights of terror as explosions shattered the darkness. Survivors clung to rafts in freezing seas, their hands and faces turning blue before rescue could arrive. The Atlantic was as much an enemy as the Germans, swallowing men whole in the cold embrace of its waters. It was a battlefield where nature and technology conspired to destroy, and in 1940 the U-boats held the advantage. The Royal Navy responded by organizing convoys, but escorts were scarce, and gaps remained large enough for wolves to slip through. Destroyers, sloops, and corvettes struggled to protect dozens of ships, their sonar operators listening for the faint echo of steel beneath the waves. Depth charges were their main weapon, barrels of explosives rolled over the stern and set to detonate at guessed depths. But sonar was imprecise, and more often than not, submarines escaped unscathed, diving deep into the Atlantic darkness. U-boat crews endured these hunts in silence, the hull groaning under pressure as explosions thundered above. Men whispered prayers, sweating in the stale air as rivets creaked with every blast. Then, when the destroyers moved on, the submarines rose again, ready to strike at the stragglers left behind. The cycle of attack, pursuit, and survival became routine, a deadly game of predator and prey. The Royal Navy fought valiantly, but in these early months, the balance leaned toward the hunters. For the convoys, safety was an illusion measured only in survival. The impact of these sinkings reached far beyond the convoys themselves. Britain's war economy strained under the pressure of lost imports, forcing rationing to intensify and factories to slow production. Tanker sinkings cut into oil reserves, threatening the Royal Air Force's ability to maintain constant patrols. Churchill, now First Lord of the Admiralty, obsessed over the tonnage war, monitoring figures daily with growing alarm. He understood that the U-boat threat was not just military, it was existential. The morale of the British people depended on keeping food on tables and fuel in tanks, and each sinking gnawed at that resolve. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin Roosevelt watched closely, recognizing that America's future was tied to the survival of Britain's supply lines. The U-boats, in their steel coffins, had created a crisis that stretched across continents. Every ship sunk was a victory for Germany, but also a reminder of how fragile Britain's survival was. The ocean had become a battlefield of global consequence, and at its heart the U-boats prowled relentlessly. Donitz's men refined their tactics with each patrol, experimenting with new ways to maximize destruction. Night surface attacks became the preferred method, with U-boats approaching silently on the waves, invisible to sonar. At close range they fired spreads of torpedoes, each detonation turning the sea into a cauldron of flame and steel. The chaos of such attacks often left escorts overwhelmed, forced to choose between rescuing survivors and hunting the attackers. U-boats sometimes lingered after sinking ships, questioning survivors for intelligence before disappearing into the night. These encounters were chilling, as lifeboats drifted in silence while shadowy figures asked for routes, speeds, and cargoes. The war at sea was personal, fought not by faceless machines but by men staring across the waves at one another. German propaganda celebrated these victories, hailing U-boat commanders as heroes of the Reich. The crews themselves measured success in tons of shipping sunk, knowing each patrol might be their last. For them the ocean was both battlefield and tomb, and every victory carried its own shadow. By 1940, the U-boat campaign escalated as Germany tightened its grip on Europe. With bases in France following the fall of Paris, U-boats could now operate much deeper into the Atlantic without exhausting fuel. The Bay of Biscay became their gateway, launching point for wolfpacks that spread across the sea lanes. This expansion extended their reach to North American waters, threatening supply lines before they could even approach Britain. Convoy escorts, already overstretched, now faced a far greater challenge, covering thousands of miles with too few ships. Air cover remained limited, leaving the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap where submarines operated with near impunity. The tonnage war entered a new phase, and Britain's survival teetered ever closer to collapse. Dönitz pressed Hitler for more submarines, insisting that only by building hundreds could victory at sea be assured. In Berlin, production ramped up, turning U-boat construction into a priority of the Reich. The hunters were multiplying, and the Atlantic would soon be filled with their shadows. The battle had only just begun. For the men who lived through it, the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic were etched in fire, salt, and memory. Merchant sailors braved the seas with little protection, their ships creaking with cargo that meant life or death for millions. Submariners faced the constant terror of depth charges, knowing each patrol could be their last. Families at home waited anxiously for news, often receiving only silence or telegrams of loss. Commanders plotted strategies on maps, but the reality of war was measured in the faces of men lost at sea. The Atlantic was a vast graveyard, claiming thousands with every passing month. Britain's fate hung by a thread, the Empire's survival tied to convoys that vanished beneath the waves. The U-boats, silent and deadly, dictated the rhythm of war in the Atlantic, and as 1940 unfolded, it became clear that the struggle would not be short or easy. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun in earnest, and it would become the longest, most crucial campaign of the Second World War. Inside a German U-boat, war was fought in shadows, silence, and suffocating confinement. These vessels, barely 220 feet long in the case of a Type 7, crammed over 40 men into a steel tube where every inch of space had a purpose. Crewmen slept in bunks wedged between torpedoes, their blankets often damp with condensation dripping from the hull. Many men shared beds in shifts, a system called hot bunking, where one sailor climbed into sheets, still warm from another's body. Food was stored in every available space, with sausages hanging from pipes and bread stuffed into torpedo racks until it molded. The air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and unwashed bodies, for water was rationed and showers were luxuries left behind on shore. Every valve, pipe, and gauge had to be monitored constantly, and the noise of machinery never ceased. Even in moments of rest, the submarine remained alive, its engines vibrating like a heartbeat. For the men inside, the U-boat was more than a weapon. It was a prison, a home, and a coffin all at once. The daily routine was dictated by the sea, by machinery, and by the constant need for vigilance. Men worked in rotating shifts, their lives divided between duty stations, sleep, and brief meals eaten hunched over cramped tables. The cook, working from a galley barely the size of a closet, prepared meals with what supplies remained fresh, though vegetables and fruit spoiled within days. Bread grew moldy, and tins of meat became staples, washed down with bitter coffee that never seemed strong enough to fight fatigue. Conversations were short, often drowned by the thrum of engines or the hiss of compressed air. Sailors learned to function in perpetual exhaustion, their bodies conditioned to snatch rest wherever they could. Privacy was non-existent, and tempers sometimes flared in the claustrophobic confines, yet discipline remained ironclad. Officers and crew shared the same hardships, blurring the lines between rank and file in a way unique to the silent service. Camaraderie became survival, each man knowing his life depended on the others. In this world, trust was the strongest currency. Every dive transformed the submarine into a steel tomb suspended in darkness. As the order to dive echoed, hatches slammed shut, ballast tanks flooded, and the boat slipped beneath the waves. The change was immediate. The air grew heavier, the silence pressing, broken only by the creak of steel under pressure. Men checked gauges obsessively, listening for the ominous groan that meant the hull was straining. In combat, silence was enforced, with sailors whispering, moving slowly, and even controlling their breathing to avoid betraying their position. The smell of oil mixed with sweat became overpowering, and the temperature climbed rapidly, especially in tropical waters where the submarine became an oven. Batteries discharged steadily, filling the air with acidic fumes that stung the eyes and lungs. Each dive carried the risk of disaster, for even a small leak could become fatal under pressure. Depth charges exploding nearby shook the hull like a giant hammer, showering men with rust flakes as they braced for death. Survival was never guaranteed. and every descent reminded the crew of how thin the line was between life and oblivion. Psychological strain was the hidden enemy aboard every patrol. The men of the U-boats lived with constant reminders of their mortality, each dive another step into the unknown. Sleep was plagued by nightmares of drowning or burning, dreams interrupted by sudden alarms that sent men scrambling to their stations. Some sailors endured claustrophobia, their panic controlled only by sheer discipline and fear of letting comrades down. Others became numb, their minds shutting out the reality of their surroundings to preserve sanity. Letters from home were treasured, read and reread until the paper nearly wore through, small anchors to a world that felt impossibly distant. Humor became a shield, with jokes told in whispers or crude songs, sung quietly during rare moments of calm. Yet the strain sometimes broke men, their nerves shattering under bombardments that lasted for hours. Donitz himself acknowledged this psychological toll, praising his men as much for their mental endurance as their technical skill. The silent service demanded not only courage, but resilience of the mind. Few emerged from it unchanged. Despite the hardship, camaraderie gave U-boat crews their strength. Officers and sailors lived in such proximity that barriers of class and rank blurred into shared hardship. Commanders ate the same food, slept in the same damp bunks, and endured the same bombardments as the lowest seamen. Bonds were forged in sweat, fear, and laughter, creating loyalty that went beyond regulation. Crews celebrated each sinking with subdued pride, their victory marked not by cheers, but by a silent toast with whatever coffee or schnapps remained. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones passed unnoticed, swallowed by the endless rhythm of patrols. But when a crewmate died, the loss reverberated through the boat like a wound in the steel itself. Survivors spoke of the silence that followed, as though the submarine itself mourned. These bonds gave meaning to their suffering, turning isolated individuals into a single machine of flesh and steel. Without that trust, no crew could endure the relentless pressure of life beneath the sea. With it they became deadly hunters. Weapons were not just tools but constant companions within the confined space. Torpedoes lined the bow and stern, their warheads slumbering beside the men who ate, slept, and prayed in their shadow. Each weighed nearly 2 tons, deadly in silence until unleashed into the ocean. Crews handled them with reverence, knowing a single mishap could end them all in fiery seconds. Reloading them in the cramped forward compartment was back-breaking work, requiring precision even as the boat rolled in heavy seas. The deck gun, mounted topside, was rarely seen once the war grew dangerous, but its shells were stacked inside the boat, a reminder of earlier times when U-boats surfaced to duel unarmed freighters. The machinery that sustained life, engines, batteries, pumps, was as much a weapon as the torpedoes, for without them the submarine was nothing but a coffin adrift. Men became intimately familiar with every valve and lever, treating each system with care born of necessity. In battle, every hand had its role, every action tied to survival. The weapons defined their existence, just as much as the steel walls that confined them. Danger came not only from the enemy but from the sea itself. Storms lashed U-boats on the surface, waves crashing over the conning tower and sweeping sailors into the freezing Atlantic. Inside, condensation dripped constantly, soaking clothes and corroding instruments, a reminder that the ocean was always trying to claim them. In tropical waters, the heat became unbearable, with temperatures inside rising above 100 degrees, sweat dripping into eyes as men worked. In Arctic patrols, the cold was just as merciless, ice forming on bulkheads and breath hanging in the air. Salt water invaded the air systems, fouling machinery and forcing constant maintenance. Rats and cockroaches thrived in the darkness, feeding on crumbs and gnawing through food stores. Even the act of surfacing to recharge batteries carried risk, for destroyers and aircraft scoured the sea with radar and searchlights. The sea was both their home and their executioner. For every man aboard, the U-boat was a fragile refuge against a vast, indifferent enemy. The ocean itself never stopped reminding them of their vulnerability. And yet, despite the hardship, the men of the U-boats carried with them a sense of pride and purpose. They knew they were the sharpest weapon in Germany's arsenal, feared by merchant sailors and dreaded by Allied commanders. Each patrol offered the chance to tilt the war in their nation's favor, to bring Britain to its knees by severing her lifeline. Their bravery was celebrated at home, where propaganda films and radio broadcasts turned U-boat commanders into heroes of the Reich. But the men themselves, cramped inside their steel tubes, measured their lives in torpedoes fired, miles sailed, and comrades lost. They endured because they believed in their mission, because their survival depended on it, and because the bond with their crewmates left no room for weakness. Their world was unlike any other branch of the war, hidden beneath the waves, silent and unseen. Life aboard a U-boat was hardship, fear and sacrifice woven into every hour. It was a life few could endure, but for those who did, it defined them forever. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood from the outset that lone submarines could not by themselves strangle Britain's lifelines. The Atlantic was vast, and while a single U-boat could sink ships, it could not destroy entire convoys guarded by escorts. Drawing from his World War I experience, Dönitz envisioned a new method of warfare built upon coordination, precision, and relentless aggression. He called it Rudel tactic, the Wolfpack tactic, where multiple submarines would converge on convoys like predators on prey. The strategy relied on U-boats forming patrol lines across shipping lanes, each boat sweeping the sea with its periscope and radio. Once a convoy was sighted, the submarine shadowed it at a distance, reporting its position back to headquarters in occupied France. Dönitz's staff would then direct nearby U-boats to converge on the convoy, surrounding it from multiple sides. When night fell, the attack began, with submarines striking from all directions at once, overwhelming the escorts. It was a tactic designed not for chance encounters, but for systematic slaughter, and in the early years of the war, it proved terrifyingly effective. Night was the Wolfpack's greatest ally, cloaking the hunters in darkness, while the convoys struggled to see their attackers. U-boats surfaced under cover of night, their low silhouettes almost invisible against the black horizon. Surfacing gave them speed, allowing them to maneuver into position and fire torpedoes with deadly accuracy. Escorts, limited by primitive radar and sonar, often failed to detect the submarines until torpedoes were already in the water. The sudden explosions ripped into merchantmen, turning the sea into a burning graveyard of oil and steel. In the chaos, panicked ships broke formation, making them even easier targets for follow-up attacks. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer perfected the art of night surface combat, slipping into the heart of convoys and firing at point-blank range. His calm precision earned him the nickname Silent Otto, and his patrols became legendary for the tonnage sunk. Others like Joachim Schepke and Günther Prien became equally renowned, their exploits celebrated in German propaganda. To the Allies, these men were predators without mercy. To the crews of the U-boats, they were the embodiment of Dönitz's doctrine. The Wolfpack attacks were meticulously planned, but often executed with instinct and daring. Communication was vital, with submarines reporting positions through encrypted radio signals to coordinate movements. These transmissions, though brief, were dangerous, for Allied direction-finding equipment could sometimes triangulate their origin. Still, Dönitz insisted on constant communication, believing coordination was worth the risk of detection. Submarines often spent days shadowing convoys, calling in reinforcements until half a dozen boats could assemble. Once in position, the commander on the scene took control, orchestrating the attack as if conducting a symphony of destruction. Torpedoes streaked from multiple directions, leaving escorts paralyzed by the impossibility of defending every flank. Some convoys lost a third of their ships in a single night, their decks aflame as survivors abandoned ship. The Wolfpack was not just a tactic, it was psychological warfare, a demonstration that the Atlantic was controlled by unseen predators. Sailors feared the night, knowing it brought not rest but death, and in that fear, the Wolfpacks multiplied their effectiveness. The success of Wolfpack tactics in 1940 and 1941 created what U-boat crews called the happy time. Convoys crossing the Atlantic suffered devastating losses, with entire fleets of merchantmen sent to the bottom in coordinated strikes. In a single month of 1941, U-boats sank more than 300,000 tons of Allied shipping, a figure that terrified British strategists. Merchant sailors spoke of nights lit by burning tankers, their cargo of oil spreading fire across the waves. Survivors floated in lifeboats, watching helplessly as other ships were struck, one after another, by invisible assailants. Escorts raced frantically, dropping depth charges where they guessed submarines might be, but often too late to prevent further destruction. Donitz's Wolfpacks appeared invincible, their commanders returning home to medals, promotions and parades. The German people celebrated them as heroes, while Allied newspapers carried grim reports of starvation and shortages. For Britain, the threat of blockade loomed larger than ever, echoing the desperation of 1917. And for the U-boats, it seemed the Atlantic had become their hunting ground without limit. Life inside the Wolfpack, however, carried dangers as great as the rewards. Coordination meant constant exposure to the risk of Allied countermeasures, for radio transmissions betrayed the presence of submarines. Escorts began to learn the patterns, predicting where Wolfpacks might assemble, and directing air patrols to strike. Attacks that once seemed effortless became increasingly costly, with U-boats driven deep beneath the waves by depth-charge barrages. The men inside endured hours of terror, clinging to their bunks as explosions thundered overhead. Water dripped from cracked seams, and the hull groaned under the strain of pressure as sailors waited in silence. Many wrote farewell letters during these bombardments, tucking them into their clothing with the faint hope they might someday be found. Even in victory, the Wolfpacks suffered attrition, with some boats failing to return from patrols, celebrated as triumphs. For every commander raised to fame, another vanished without a trace. The ocean remained a cruel equalizer, rewarding boldness but punishing carelessness with instant death. In the Wolfpacks, glory and destruction walked hand in hand. For the merchant sailors who faced the Wolfpacks, the experience was a nightmare without equal. Convoy duty meant weeks of slow travel across the endless grey Atlantic, where every shadow on the horizon carried menace. They slept in their clothes, ready to abandon ship at the first explosion. Lifeboat drills became ritual, though most knew that in freezing waters survival time was measured in minutes. When torpedoes struck, chaos reigned, fires erupted, ships listed, and men leapt into the sea as oil spread across the surface. Survivors huddled in lifeboats, hearing the cries of comrades fade into the dark, while U-boats prowled silently nearby. Some sailors swore they saw commanders surface to question them, asking for convoy routes before vanishing again into the night. Fear of the Wolfpacks was as powerful as the torpedoes themselves, eroding morale and shaking confidence in the safety of the seas. Merchant shipping was more than logistics, it was the artery of Britain's survival. And with every sinking, the Wolfpack struck at the very heart of the nation's will to fight. The Allied response grew increasingly urgent as the Wolfpack threat mounted. Britain expanded convoy escort groups, building corvettes and destroyers as fast as shipyards could manage. Sonar and depth charge tactics improved, giving escorts better chances of detecting and destroying submarines. Aircraft carriers and long-range patrol planes began closing the mid-Atlantic gap, denying U-boats the sanctuary they once enjoyed. Intelligence gathering, particularly through code breaking, offered new ways to anticipate Wolfpack movements. Yet in the early years, these improvements lagged behind the scale of the U-boat threat. Dönitz pressed relentlessly, arguing that with 300 submarines at sea, he could force Britain to surrender. Germany poured resources into building more U-boats, filling pens in France with new vessels rolling out at a steady pace. The Battle of the Atlantic became a war of numbers, ships built versus ships sunk, and in that grim arithmetic, the Wolfpack seemed poised to tip the balance. The struggle was becoming one of endurance, fought mile by mile, ton by ton, life by life. By 1942, the Wolfpack tactics had spread the war far beyond the British Isles, reaching deep into the Western Hemisphere. With America's entry into the war, U-boats surged toward the East Coast in a campaign Dönitz called Operation Drumbeat. Tankers and freighters burned in sight of American cities, their flames reflecting against the night sky. The Wolfpacks adapted easily to these new waters, exploiting America's initial lack of coastal defenses. The Atlantic became a killing ground, stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, with merchant losses mounting at terrifying speed. But with expansion came risk, and Allied countermeasures grew stronger with each passing month. The Wolfpacks would eventually face a turning tide, their dominance challenged by technology, intelligence, and sheer industrial might. Yet in their early years, they represented the apex of U-boat warfare, a strategy that nearly brought Britain to her knees. The Wolfpack was more than a tactic, it was a symbol of the Predator's supremacy at sea, and its shadow defined the Battle of the Atlantic. By 1941, Britain understood that survival hinged not just on courage at sea, but on innovation and relentless adaptation. The U-boat menace had pushed the nation to the brink, threatening to choke off supplies of food, fuel, and war materials. In response, scientists, shipbuilders, and strategists embarked on a race against time to counter the silent killers beneath the waves. At the heart of this effort stood a device known as ADSIC, the early form of sonar, which could detect submarines by bouncing sound waves off their hulls. Operators listened intently through headphones, straining to distinguish faint echoes from the natural noise of the ocean. It was far from perfect, but it gave escorts their first real chance of hunting submarines in darkness. Depth charges, crude yet devastating, became the weapon of choice, rolled over the stern in patterns meant to bracket enemy positions. These barrels of explosives, detonating at set depth, turned the sea into a thunderous cauldron of pressure and shock waves. For U-boat crews, the ping of sonar became the sound of impending death, and for Allied escorts it became the first hope of turning hunters into hunted. The Royal Navy expanded its escort forces, realizing that convoys could only survive with constant protection. Corvettes of the Flower class, small and hastily built, were dispatched in large numbers to shepherd merchantmen across the Atlantic. These ships lacked the glamour of battleships or cruisers, but their crews carried the weight of survival on their shoulders. Destroyers, faster and more heavily armed, became the strike arm of the escort groups, rushing to attack sonar contacts with depth charges. Escort commanders learned to operate in groups, coordinating attacks to keep submarines submerged and unable to maneuver. This forced U-boats to drain their batteries and limited their ability to launch coordinated Wolfpack strikes. The mere presence of escorts reassured merchant sailors, who knew they were no longer alone against the dark. Yet every convoy still carried risk, for U-boats adapted as quickly as they were challenged. The battle became one of wits, of innovation, and of endurance across an unforgiving ocean. The escorts were the shield, fragile, yet unyielding, and their presence marked the beginning of resistance. Air power soon emerged as one of the most decisive factors in the struggle against the U-boats. Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force expanded its patrols, sending long-range aircraft to scour the sea for signs of submarines. Catalinas and Sunderlands patrolled vast stretches of the Atlantic, armed with depth charges and bombs. Pilots learned to spot periscopes glinting in the sun, or oil slicks trailing across the surface. For submarines, surfacing to recharge batteries now carried mortal risk, as aircraft could swoop down without warning. In 1942, the introduction of Very Long Range (VLR) liberators closed much of the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap, denying U-boats their sanctuary. Aircraft carriers, converted from merchant hulls, added another dimension, carrying fighters and bombers directly into convoy routes. The ocean was no longer safe for U-boats once daylight broke, and many crews spoke of the terror of hearing engines overhead. Survival demanded stealth, but stealth was increasingly compromised by relentless air patrols. The Allies had extended their reach across the waves, and the skies became as deadly as the sea below. Technological progress gave escorts sharper teeth and longer reach. Radar, initially primitive, was refined into sets capable of detecting submarines on the surface at night. No longer could U-boats approach convoys unseen under cover of darkness, their silhouettes betrayed by the sweep of invisible beams. HF/DF, nicknamed Huff Duff, triangulated U-boat radio transmissions, allowing escorts to track Wolfpack coordination. Combined with sonar, radar, and intelligence, escorts became increasingly adept at predicting submarine positions. Hedgehog, a new anti-submarine mortar, fired patterns of contact-fused bombs ahead of ships, striking submarines without warning. These weapons transformed the hunter's game, reducing the advantage submarines once held. For the first time, escorts could strike before U-boats launched their attacks, forcing them into defensive dives. Technology did not eliminate the U-boat threat, but it narrowed the window of opportunity for successful strikes. The sea was still vast, but the shadows in which the hunters once thrived were shrinking, and with each innovation, the balance of the Atlantic War shifted. The human element of the fight back was no less vital than machines. Escort crews endured endless nights on storm-tossed seas, staring into darkness for signs of periscopes or torpedo wakes. Sonar operators, their ears pressed to headphones, bore immense responsibility, for one missed contact could mean dozens of ships lost. Pilots flew long, lonely missions over grey expanses, often returning with empty fuel tanks and eyes bloodshot from hours of scanning the waves. Many escorts and aircraft were lost themselves, sacrificed to protect convoys against an enemy that struck invisibly. Yet morale stiffened as victories increased, each destroyed U-boat celebrated as a reprieve for the merchant sailors. Survivors rescued from lifeboats spoke of the relief at seeing a corvette's silhouette on the horizon. These men knew the escorts were their only shield against annihilation. The human cost was immense, but so too was the determination. In the war against the U-boats, technology was nothing without courage, and courage was the Allies' most renewable resource. By 1942, escort groups had grown into organized hunter-killer formations, designed not only to defend but to destroy. Led by aggressive captains, these groups included destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft working in unison to sweep the seas. When a submarine was detected, the group moved with precision, herding the U-boat with sonar and attacks until its destruction was assured. Some battles lasted for hours, depth charges hammering the depths, while escorts circled relentlessly. The strain on U-boat crews was unimaginable, as they endured bombardments that rattled nerves and broke machinery. Hulls groaned, gauges shattered, and men prayed in the suffocating dark as pressure mounted. Survivors described the eerie quiet after depth charge attacks, broken only by the hiss of leaking pipes. For many U-boats, there was no escape, their final moments marked by desperate efforts to surface before being crushed. Hunter-killer groups turned the tables, showing that submarines could be hunted just as ruthlessly as they hunted, and their successes gave hope that the U-boat menace might one day be defeated. The strategic significance of these developments cannot be overstated. Britain's survival depended on keeping convoys afloat, and every improvement in escort tactics directly impacted the outcome of the war. Food shipments reached tables, fuel-powered aircraft, and steel-fed factories that produced weapons in massive quantities. The Allies recognized that the Battle of the Atlantic was not a side campaign, but the foundation upon which victory would be built. Churchill himself called it the dominating factor throughout the war, acknowledging its central importance. The fight back was not swift or easy, but it bought precious time, blunting the effectiveness of wolfpacks. German commanders, once triumphant, now faced increasing losses and dwindling morale as their prey became harder to kill. Dönitz pressed for more submarines, but the tide was slowly turning. For the Allies, every convoy that arrived intact was a triumph of technology, coordination, and bravery. The ocean was no longer a battlefield ruled by shadows alone. It was becoming a contested space, where hunters could die as easily as their prey. And yet, the U-boat war was far from over, and the fight back carried its own brutal costs. Escorts were lost, aircraft shot down, and convoys still paid in lives and tonnage for every crossing. Submarine crews, though increasingly hunted, remained deadly, striking with skill honed by years of combat. The battle became a struggle of endurance, measured in steel built and lives lost on both sides. The Allies had begun to claw back the initiative, but victory was not yet certain. Each innovation forced the Germans to adapt, and each adaptation sparked new countermeasures. The Atlantic remained a vast chessboard, where every move carried consequences of global magnitude. In the years ahead, intelligence, production, and strategy would intertwine in ways never before seen in warfare. But in these years, 1941 and 1942, the fight back had begun in earnest. The hunters were no longer unchallenged, and the Battle of the Atlantic was entering a new, deadlier phase. In the silent war beneath the waves, victory often hinged not on torpedoes or depth charges, but on words carried invisibly through the ether. German U-boats relied on constant radio communication to coordinate patrol lines, shadow convoys, and execute wolfpack attacks across the vast Atlantic. Each signal was encrypted with a device called Enigma, a machine of rotors and wires that produced an ever-shifting code seemingly unbreakable. The Germans believed Enigma was impregnable, changing settings daily and trusting its complexity to keep secrets safe. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, Enigma was the nervous system of the U-boat arm, allowing Central Command in occupied France to direct submarines thousands of miles away. But in truth, every message sent through the air left a trail, faint but not invisible. In Britain, mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions gathered in secret to unlock these mysteries. Their headquarters was Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion turned into the heart of Allied code-breaking. Here the Battle of the Atlantic was waged not with ships, but with intellect. And here the war would turn. The Enigma machine itself was a marvel of German engineering, designed to scramble messages into millions of possible combinations. Each keystroke passed through 3 rotating rotors, a plug board and a reflector, producing a cipher that changed with every press. Operators set the rotors daily according to codebooks, meaning the same letter typed twice never appeared as the same encrypted letter. To the Germans, this complexity was reassurance, a barrier that no enemy could possibly breach. But Allied code breakers saw it not as impregnable, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. The first breakthroughs came before the war, when Polish cryptanalysts Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różicki, and Henryk Zygalski reconstructed the workings of Enigma through brilliant mathematical deduction. They built early decryption devices and passed their knowledge to Britain and France in 1939, just before Poland fell. This gift gave the Allies a starting point, a crack in what seemed like an unbreakable wall. From that foundation, Bletchley Park's war would begin in earnest, and the clock was ticking, for every unsolved message cost lives at sea. Bletchley Park quickly became a hive of relentless intellectual warfare, staffed by thousands of men and women sworn to secrecy. Mathematicians like Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman devised mechanical bombs capable of testing rotor settings at unprecedented speed. Linguists scoured intercepted messages for repeated phrases and habits of German operators, known as cribs, which could unlock otherwise impossible puzzles. Wrens of the Women's Royal Naval Service worked tirelessly to operate the machines, their hands guiding the wheels of fate with each rotation. Intercept stations across Britain and its colonies, codenamed Y stations, captured German transmissions day and night, feeding them to Bletchley in endless streams. Inside dimly lit huts, teams worked in near silence, their concentration absolute as they pieced together fragments of meaning. The pressure was immense, for a convoy's survival often depended on cracking messages within hours, not days. Breakthroughs were celebrated quietly, with exhausted smiles and whispered relief, before the next message demanded attention. There was no glory, only the knowledge that every decrypted signal meant lives saved. In that secrecy, the unsung heroes of the Atlantic War labored. The intelligence derived from these efforts was code-named Ultra, a word that would become synonymous with decisive advantage. Ultra provided Allied commanders with U-boat positions, Wolfpack intentions, and even daily movement orders from Donitz's headquarters. Convoys were rerouted around danger zones, sometimes slipping past entire Wolfpacks that never knew they had been avoided. Escort groups were dispatched to ambush submarines lying in wait, turning hunters into the hunted. For merchant sailors, unaware of the secret guiding their course, survival often seemed like fortune or fate. In reality, it was the product of minds and machines hidden in the English countryside. Yet Ultra's use was carefully concealed, for if the Germans suspected Enigma was broken, they would change their systems. This secrecy meant commanders sometimes allowed ships to be sunk rather than reveal their knowledge, a bitter calculation of sacrifice. Ultra was not just an advantage, it was a delicate weapon to be wielded with caution. Its value lay not in single victories, but in the long war of attrition, and in that war it tipped the scales. The German belief in Enigma's security was so absolute that even mounting losses did not shake their confidence. U-boat commanders trusted their signals completely, certain that no enemy could possibly read them. They transmitted positions, patrol orders, and even weather reports, unaware that each message was another thread for Bletchley to weave. When Wolfpacks assembled, Ultra often knew their locations in advance, guiding convoys safely past. When Donitz shifted patrol lines, Allied escorts shifted with equal speed, as though anticipating every move. Yet suspicion never grew deep enough to change procedures, and German complacency became the Allies' greatest ally. Some officers suspected leaks from spies or aerial reconnaissance, but few dared to question the machine itself. Enigma remained their shield, even as it betrayed them daily. The irony was profound. The very tool that gave them coordination also became their undoing. The U-boat fleet, bound by its dependence on encrypted communication, was fighting with its secrets exposed, and still, they never knew. The human stories behind these cryptographic battles reveal a war fought far from the front lines, yet no less perilous in consequence. Alan Turing, a shy and brilliant mathematician, revolutionized the use of machines to break ciphers, his work laying the foundation for modern computing. Gordon Welchman's idea of diagonal boards accelerated the bombs, cutting weeks into hours. Thousands of young women, often overlooked by history, worked tirelessly in huts filled with clattering machines, their labor as essential as any sailors on the Atlantic. Sleep was scarce, and the pressure immense, for delays meant convoys walking blindly into Wolfpack jaws. Victories were rarely celebrated, for the work remained secret even from family and friends. After the war, many returned to ordinary lives, never speaking of the role they had played in saving millions of tons of shipping. For them, recognition came decades later, long after their sacrifices had been forgotten. Their silence mirrored the silence of the submarines they fought. In both, secrecy defined survival. The impact of Ultra on the Battle of the Atlantic was staggering, though hidden at the time. By mid-1941, Allied shipping losses, while still severe, began to decline in convoys routed with intelligence guidance. Hunter-killer groups achieved notable successes, sinking U-boats with uncanny precision that baffled Donitz. The breaking of the four-rotor Enigma used by U-boats in 1942 restored an advantage temporarily lost, reopening the floodgates of intelligence. This breakthrough allowed Allied planners to anticipate the largest Wolfpack operations, sometimes saving entire convoys from annihilation. Combined with improved escorts, radar, and air cover, Ultra formed the backbone of a comprehensive defense. It gave commanders foresight in a war where knowledge was power and secrecy was survival. Without it, Britain might well have been starved into submission before America's full weight could be felt. With it, the Allies gained breathing space, time to build, and eventually to strike back. In this silent duel of intellect, Bletchley Park had turned the tide, and the U-boats never knew why. As the war advanced, the role of cryptography became a foundation of Allied victory, though hidden behind layers of secrecy. The Battle of the Atlantic remained brutal, but its outcome increasingly favored those with foresight rather than chance. Bletchley Park continued its work in silence, decoding signals even as bombs fell on Britain and convoys burned at sea. Each breakthrough reminded commanders that victory was as much about intelligence as it was about firepower. The men at sea still paid with blood, but their chances of survival grew with every message decrypted. The struggle between cipher and codebreaker became one of the most decisive unseen battles of the Second World War. In the aftermath, historians would call Ultra a decisive factor in Allied victory, shortening the war by years. But for those who lived it, there was only the endless race to keep pace with Enigma's secrets. In the shadows of Bletchley, the silent war was won, and in the Atlantic, the hunters found themselves hunted by knowledge itself. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, the US Navy found itself reeling from the devastation at Pearl Harbor. Battleships lay in ruin. Aircraft carriers were suddenly the fleet's only capital ships, and Japan's navy seemed unstoppable across the Pacific. Yet amid the wreckage, one weapon remained intact and ready to fight the submarine fleet: American submarines, mostly of the Gato class, became the silent hunters of the Pacific, tasked with severing Japan's sprawling empire from its lifelines. From the very beginning, Washington understood that Japan's industrial power depended on the constant flow of oil, rubber, and raw materials from Southeast Asia. Without shipping, the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt, and submarines were the perfect tool to carry out this mission. Unlike the Atlantic, there was no hesitation about commerce warfare. American commanders unleashed their boats immediately against merchant vessels. Submariners accepted the challenge, knowing they would fight a long, lonely war across immense distances. The silent service had been underestimated before. In the Pacific, it would become decisive. The Gato-class submarines, and later the Barlow class, were marvels of American engineering, designed for long-range patrols across the world's largest ocean. At 311 feet long, and displacing more than 1,500 tons, they carried torpedoes in both bow and stern tubes, as well as a deck gun for surface combat. These boats had the endurance to patrol for 2 months without resupply, sustained by fuel, provisions, and the grit of their crews. Inside, conditions were cramped and harsh, with bunks stacked in narrow compartments and air growing foul after weeks submerged. Yet compared to their German counterparts, American submariners enjoyed relative advantages, including air conditioning and larger living spaces. Their missions, however, were far more punishing, often lasting 70 days or more in enemy waters. Crews navigated vast expanses of ocean with only dead reckoning, sextants and radios guiding them toward their hunting grounds. Patrols stretched from the Philippines to the Japanese home islands, each voyage a test of endurance as much as skill. These steel predators became the spear point of America's Pacific strategy, and their impact would be catastrophic for Japan. The early months of the campaign, however, were marked by frustration and bitter disappointment. American torpedoes, the Mark 14S, were plagued by catastrophic design flaws that went undetected for years. Warheads failed to explode, magnetic detonators misfired, and depth controls sent torpedoes running too deep beneath targets. Submariners risked their lives to stalk convoys, only to watch their torpedoes bounce harmlessly off hulls or detonate prematurely. Commanders filed desperate reports, but the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to admit fault, blaming crews for poor tactics. Only after exhaustive field tests in 1943 did the truth emerge, vindicating the men who had endured endless failures. By then, dozens of submarines had returned empty-handed, their patrols filled with stories of missed opportunities and near-suicidal attacks. These technical failures cost lives, delayed the submarine campaign, and allowed Japanese shipping to operate longer than it should have. Yet once corrected, the torpedoes became devastatingly effective, turning the silent service into a weapon of unmatched lethality. The ordeal forged the submariners' determination, and once freed of defective weapons, they unleashed fury on Japan's merchant fleet. The geography of the Pacific shaped the submarine war in ways unique from the Atlantic. Japanese shipping lanes stretched thousands of miles, winding from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the factories of Honshu. Convoys were sparse and poorly defended, often protected by only a handful of escorts and outdated aircraft. Unlike Britain, Japan never built an effective convoy system, believing its navy could defend sea lanes with battleships and cruisers. This arrogance left merchantmen vulnerable to prowling American submarines that struck where protection was weakest. Crews learned to position themselves along choke points, the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, and the approaches to Japan itself. There, submarines waited patiently, engines silent, until convoys sailed directly into their ambush. Attacks came suddenly, torpedoes streaking through dark waters and detonating with thunderous eruptions. Survivors described ships vanishing in seconds, swallowed by flames or breaking apart beneath their feet. The Pacific's vastness was no protection. Instead, it became a hunting ground too large for Japan to defend, and the silent service claimed it piece by piece. The results were staggering once the torpedo problems were resolved, and the campaign reached full momentum. By 1944, American submarines were sinking nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet, cutting deeply into the arteries of its war economy. Tankers carrying oil from Borneo and Sumatra were prime targets, their destruction forcing Japan into crippling fuel shortages. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy struggled to sortie its warships, with carriers and battleships often confined to port for lack of fuel. Food shortages spread across Japan as rice shipments from Southeast Asia were sunk in vast quantities. Submarines also targeted troop transports, drowning thousands of soldiers bound for distant garrisons before they ever reached battle. The cumulative effect was devastating. Japan's economy collapsed, its navy withered, and its armies were left isolated on distant islands. Unlike the Atlantic, where victory came after years of attrition, the submarine war in the Pacific was swift, brutal, and decisive. The silent service had struck at Japan's lifeblood, and Japan had no answer. The human stories of this campaign reveal both courage and tragedy. Submariners lived on the edge, their patrols filled with tension as they crept close to enemy harbors or stalked convoys under cover of night. Crews celebrated victories with quiet satisfaction, knowing every ship sunk shortened the war. Yet losses were heavy, with 1 in 5 submariners never returning home, the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. Boats disappeared without trace, their fate learned only years later when records were recovered from Japan. Families waited in silence, receiving letters that never came, their grief hidden beneath the war's larger story. Those who survived spoke of endless tension, of sweat dripping in tropical heat, of silence broken only by the ping of sonar and the distant thunder of depth charges. The submarine war was relentless, fought in suffocating steel coffins where every dive might be the last. It demanded not only skill, but an iron will to endure, and it left scars on every man who sailed beneath the waves. Among the most famous victories were the sinking of Japanese warships, proof that submarines were not confined to commerce raiding alone. The USS Wahoo, commanded by Dudley Mush Morton, became legendary for its aggressive patrols, sinking multiple ships in daring surface attacks. The USS Harder, under Samuel Dealey, destroyed 5 Japanese destroyers in a single patrol, earning the nickname Submarine Killer. In 1944, the USS Cavour torpedoed and sank the aircraft carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Other boats claimed cruisers, destroyers, and even battleships, proving that no Japanese vessel was safe. These victories boosted morale, bringing headlines back home and cementing the silent service's reputation. Yet commanders also carried heavy burdens, knowing their aggressive tactics often pushed crews to the brink of exhaustion. The line between triumph and tragedy was thin, and many celebrated submariners never returned from later patrols. Heroism was constant, but so was sacrifice. The Pacific was unforgiving to both hunter and hunted. By the end of the war, American submarines had destroyed more than 1,100 Japanese merchant ships and nearly 200 warships. They accounted for 55% of Japan's total losses at sea, despite comprising less than 2% of the US Navy's manpower. This disproportionate impact underscored the strategic brilliance of the campaign and the courage of the men who carried it out. The silent service had lived up to its name, fighting a war invisible to most Americans but decisive in its outcome. Without shipping, Japan could not sustain its armies, fuel its planes or sail its warships. The submarines had done what fleets of battleships could not. They had strangled an empire in the silence of the deep with patience, courage, and steel. The US Navy had won one of the most decisive campaigns of the Second World War. The Pacific would forever remember the hunters that stalked its waters, and history would remember the silent service as the shadow that helped bring Japan to defeat. Every battle fought beneath the waves was shaped by the machines that carried men into the depths. Submarines were not all alike. Each navy crafted designs that reflected its doctrine, geography, and strategic ambitions. The Germans favored boats optimized for the Atlantic, sleek and deadly hunters built to stalk convoys across storm-tossed seas. The Americans required long-range vessels capable of traversing the Pacific's vast distances, carrying supplies for patrols lasting months. Britain built boats designed for versatility, operating in the confined waters of the Mediterranean and the distant reaches of empire. Japan, envisioning decisive fleet battles, invested in massive submarines capable of carrying aircraft, the largest undersea vessels of their time. Even the Soviet Union fielded formidable fleets, emphasizing numbers and endurance in preparation for wars of attrition. Each class carried its own strengths and weaknesses, advantages and fatal flaws, and in their steel hulls, nations projected their hopes for victory. The arsenal of submarines defined not only tactics, but the very nature of undersea warfare. The German Type 7 was the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, the most numerous and iconic submarine of the war. At just over 220 feet long, it was compact yet lethal, armed with 5 torpedo tubes and carrying 14 torpedoes. Its small size gave it agility, allowing it to maneuver quickly during convoy attacks, especially at night on the surface. Crews of 45 men lived in harsh conditions, crammed into narrow compartments with little comfort. The Type 7's range was limited compared to its American counterparts, but it was ideal for operations from bases in France against North Atlantic convoys. Its endurance was enough to patrol for weeks, striking fear into merchantmen and escorts alike. The Type 7 became the backbone of the Wolfpacks, its silhouette etched into the nightmares of sailors. Over 700 were built, making it the most produced submarine class in history. Yet with mass production came vulnerability, and as Allied technology advanced, these boats became as much targets as predators. The Type 7 embodied both Germany's early dominance and its eventual attrition. For longer missions, the Germans relied on the larger Type 9, a formidable ocean-going boat designed to reach far beyond the Atlantic. At over 250 feet in length, it carried more torpedoes, heavier armament, and greater fuel capacity. These submarines patrolled the waters off Africa, South America, and even the United States, striking at shipping where defenses were weakest. Type 9 boats became infamous during Operation Drumbeat, when they ravaged American coastal shipping in 1942. Their crews endured long voyages, sometimes lasting 3 months, pushing endurance and morale to the limit. Conditions were even harsher than in the Type 7, with heat, foul air, and exhaustion constant companions. Yet the prestige of commanding a Type 9 was immense, for these missions carried the war to the enemy's doorstep. Some were modified as supply submarines, known as milk cows, carrying fuel and provisions to extend the endurance of the Wolfpacks. Others carried experimental weapons, reflecting Germany's constant search for new advantages. The Type 9 symbolized reach and ambition, proof that the U-boat war was never confined to the North Atlantic. The United States answered with the Gato class, the backbone of its submarine fleet in the Pacific. At 311 feet long, and displacing over 1,500 tons, These boats dwarfed the German U-boats in size and endurance. They carried 10 torpedo tubes and up to 24 torpedoes, as well as a deck gun for surface action. Their range was immense, allowing patrols of 11,000 nautical miles and endurance of 70 days. Crews of over 60 men benefited from relative comfort, including air conditioning, refrigeration, and larger living spaces compared to their German counterparts. The Gato class was designed for the Pacific's vast distances, capable of patrolling from Pearl Harbor to the South China Sea without resupply. They proved versatile, striking merchant convoys, warships, and conducting reconnaissance missions. Later classes, such as the Barlow, improved on the Gato with thicker hulls and greater diving depths. These boats became the scourge of Japanese shipping, accounting for more than half of all tonnage lost by Japan. The Gato was not merely a weapon, it was a floating fortress of endurance, perfectly suited to its theatre. The British, constrained by geography, emphasized versatility in their submarine designs. The T-class became the backbone of the Royal Navy's silent service, operating in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and beyond. At 275 feet long, the T-class carried up to 16 torpedoes, an unusually heavy load for its size. Designed to fight in confined waters, it featured a lower profile and excellent maneuverability, ideal for ambushing Axis shipping in the Mediterranean. Crews of over 60 men endured conditions nearly as harsh as their German counterparts, with heat, stale air, and constant risk of detection. T-class submarines scored notable successes, sinking Italian warships and Axis merchant convoys bound for North Africa. Their role extended beyond commerce raiding, supporting amphibious operations and landing commandos on hostile shores. British submarines often worked in coordination with surface fleets, reflecting Britain's integrated naval doctrine. While less famous than German or American boats, the T-class carried its share of victories and losses with equal determination. In their steel hulls, Britain defended its empire's sea lanes and contested the Mediterranean's strategic waters. The T-class symbolized endurance under pressure. The Japanese took submarine design in a direction unlike any other navy, reflecting their vision of decisive fleet battles. Their I-class submarines were massive, some over 350 feet long, with the range to patrol the Indian Ocean and even approach the American West Coast. Many were equipped with aircraft hangars, carrying float planes for reconnaissance and surprise attacks. These boats represented technological ambition, but they were built for a doctrine that prioritized fleet scouting over commerce raiding. Japan envisioned its submarines shadowing enemy carriers and battleships, relaying intelligence for decisive naval engagements. In practice, this doctrine squandered opportunities to cripple American logistics, for Japanese submarines rarely targeted merchant convoys. Instead, they focused on warships, scoring notable successes like the sinking of the carrier Wasp in 1942. Conditions aboard were austere, with crews enduring long patrols across immense distances. Their large size made them slower to dive and easier to detect, reducing survivability against increasingly capable Allied escorts. The I-class submarines were engineering marvels, but strategic failures. They reflected a vision of war that never materialized. The Soviet Union, though less celebrated, maintained one of the largest submarine fleets of the war. Their designs emphasized quantity, with hundreds of boats built for defense of coastal waters and regional seas. Classes like the Shuka and K-class operated in the Baltic, Black Sea, and Arctic, striking Axis shipping despite difficult conditions. Soviet submarines faced harsh challenges, including poor maintenance, limited resources, and treacherous icebound waters. Crews endured primitive conditions, with little comfort and constant risk of mechanical failure. Yet they fought with determination, sinking German supply ships bound for the Eastern Front and disrupting Axis operations. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel also depended on Soviet submarines to contest German naval forces. Though their contribution is often overshadowed by the larger Atlantic and Pacific campaigns, Soviet submariners paid a heavy price in lives. They demonstrated that undersea warfare was not limited to the great oceans, but fought in every corner of the globe. In the ice and cold of northern waters, the Red Navy's submarines carried their own silent war, and their sacrifices were immense. The arsenal of submarines in World War II reflected the diversity of strategy, ambition, and geography. Germany's Type 7 and Nikes embodied ruthless efficiency and reach, striking fear into Atlantic convoys. America's Gato class carried the war deep into the Pacific, severing Japan's lifelines with unmatched endurance. Britain's T-class proved versatile and effective in contested seas, fighting both commerce and warships with equal tenacity. Japan's I-class revealed technological ambition but strategic miscalculation, a fleet built for battles that never came. The Soviet Union's submarines showed that numbers and determination could contest even the harshest waters. Each class was a mirror of the nation that built it, shaped by doctrine and necessity. Each crew lived in steel coffins, facing conditions few could imagine, and each left a legacy written in the tonnage sunk, the lives lost, and the silent endurance of the men within. Together they formed the arsenal of submarines that defined the undersea war, and through them the ocean became the deadliest battlefield of all. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a grim crescendo, with merchantmen burning nightly and U-boats prowling the seas in greater numbers than ever before. Admiral Karl Donitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, had committed nearly 200 submarines to the Atlantic, confident that Britain could still be starved into submission. Convoys faced wolfpacks of 20 or more boats, their coordinated attacks devastating unescorted shipping. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent German dominance, a shift was already underway. Allied shipyards were launching escorts faster than U-boats could sink them, and air cover was closing the once vast mid-Atlantic gap. Ultra-intelligence gave commanders advanced knowledge of wolfpack movements, guiding convoys around danger or preparing escorts for ambush. New technologies, radar, sonar, and high-frequency direction finding were now integrated into every escort group. The hunters still struck hard, but their prey was no longer helpless. The spring of 1943 would prove decisive, and the tide of the Atlantic War would turn at last. The introduction of long-range aircraft changed the face of the campaign almost overnight. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, with its immense endurance, now patrolled deep into the mid-ocean, denying U-boats the sanctuary they once relied upon. Coastal Command Sunderlands and Catalinas expanded their reach as well, prowling seas that had once been safe hunting grounds. Radar-equipped aircraft detected submarines even at night, swooping down to unleash depth charges before crews could dive. The U-boat commanders, who had once surfaced boldly to attack under cover of darkness, now faced death from above with every breath of fresh air. Refueling at sea from milk cow submarines became perilous, with Allied aircraft homing in on gatherings in mid-ocean. The vast Atlantic, once the U-boat's domain, now felt small, compressed by wings that could cover thousands of miles. Survivors of aircraft attacks spoke of sudden explosions, blinding searchlights, and the horror of being trapped as their boats broke apart. The skies had become the deadliest enemy of the undersea hunters, and the German advantage was slipping away. Meanwhile, Escort groups were transformed into aggressive hunter-killer formations that pursued submarines relentlessly. No longer content to simply protect convoys, these groups went on the offensive, sweeping suspected Wolfpack zones with coordination and precision. Equipped with hedgehog mortars and improved sonar, destroyers and corvettes struck with deadly accuracy. Depth charge patterns became tighter, forcing U-boats to endure bombardments that rattled hulls and nerves for hours. The once feared Wolfpacks now found themselves disorganized, their attacks blunted before they could sink more than a handful of ships. Escort carriers added another dimension, launching aircraft directly from convoys to patrol surrounding seas. Their pilots spotted periscopes, oil slicks, and even snorkel masts, striking with speed before U-boats could react. Submarine crews spoke of being hounded day and night, with nowhere to hide except deeper waters where hulls strained and gauges shattered. Many boats never returned, vanishing without trace, as escorts circled above their watery graves. The hunter and hunted had exchanged places, and in this relentless pursuit, Germany's silent killers were themselves being silenced. The statistics told the scale of this reversal with brutal clarity. In March 1943, U-boats inflicted heavy losses, sinking nearly 600,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. Yet only 2 months later, in May, the situation collapsed dramatically for Germany. Convoy battles that once yielded dozens of Allied sinkings now ended in catastrophic U-boat losses. In just 4 weeks, 41 German submarines were destroyed, nearly 1/4 of the operational fleet. Dönitz withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic, recognizing that the losses were unsustainable. For the first time in the war, U-boats were no longer a decisive threat, but a diminishing force. The merchantmen kept sailing, carrying tanks, planes, and food across the ocean with increasing security. Britain, once on the brink of starvation, now saw its lifeline restored by technology, strategy, and relentless production. The U-boat arm, once hailed as Germany's sharpest weapon, had been blunted, and the Allies had seized the initiative in the longest campaign of the war. The experience of U-boat crews during this turning point was harrowing beyond measure. Patrols that once promised glory now meant near certain death, with survival rates plummeting as escorts and aircraft closed the trap. Men endured endless depth charge attacks, the sea around them erupting like an earthquake as they cowered in silence. The stench of diesel, sweat, and fear filled the hull, while condensation dripped like rain inside the steel coffin. Nerves frayed as hours of bombardment stretched into days, with crews whispering prayers or writing farewell notes. Many boats surfaced only to be torn apart by strafing aircraft, their survivors flung into oil-slicked seas. Letters from home went unread, stored in lockers that would never again be opened. Even the most experienced commanders confessed despair, realizing their war was now unwinnable. The camaraderie of crews was tested to its limit, forged in terror but broken by attrition. For many submariners, the Atlantic had become less a battlefield and more a graveyard, and hope dwindled with each passing patrol. For Allied sailors, the shift was felt in growing confidence and renewed determination. Convoy duty remained grueling, with storms, exhaustion, and danger constant companions. But the odds were now in their favor, and sailors began to believe survival was possible. Rescued survivors of U-boat attacks told their stories not with despair, but with resilience, knowing reinforcements and protection were stronger than ever. Escort commanders took pride in sinking submarines, each kill a vindication of training and technology. Aircraft crews returned from patrols with photographs of smoking oil slicks, proof that their long hours scanning empty seas had borne fruit. The morale of the merchant fleet stiffened, bolstered by the knowledge that they were no longer lambs to slaughter. The Atlantic crossing remained dangerous, but the terror of 1940 and 1941 had begun to fade. In its place was a sense of control, fragile but growing, and with every successful convoy, the Allied war machine surged forward, supplied and unstoppable. For Dönitz, the collapse of 1943 was both personal and professional tragedy. He had built the U-boat arm with unwavering conviction, believing it could break Britain and decide the war. Now he watched as his crews were consumed at a rate that could not be sustained, their losses outweighing their victories. Appeals for more boats were answered too late, and even Germany's advanced designs, the Type Tex X1 and Tex T, arrived only in the war's final months. He shifted tactics, sending submarines to new theaters, but the decisive battle for the Atlantic had already been lost. His faith in Enigma's security had blinded him to the Allied advantage of intelligence. His reliance on wolfpacks had been outpaced by radar, aircraft, and escort carriers. The dream of strangling Britain's supply line had become a nightmare of attrition. And in that nightmare, Germany's finest sailors were sacrificed in a war they could no longer win. The turning tide of 1943 marked the end of the U-boat's dominance, and for Dönitz, it was the death knell of his vision. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic was transformed from a battlefield of terror into a corridor of strength. Convoys arrived with increasing regularity, delivering the supplies that would fuel invasions in Italy, Normandy, and beyond. The United States industrial might surged across the ocean, unimpeded by the predators that had once feasted on merchantmen. Britain breathed easier, its people no longer fearing starvation from the sea. The U-boat arm, once the symbol of German defiance, had been broken, its remnants scattered across distant patrol areas. Though submarines would fight on until the war's end, their decisive moment had passed forever. The Atlantic had consumed tens of thousands of lives, but its outcome was now certain. The turning tide had come not with a single battle, but with a relentless convergence of technology, strategy, and courage. 1943 was the year the hunters became the hunted, and from that year onward, the ocean belonged to the Allies. The Mediterranean Sea, though narrow and sunlit, became one of the deadliest arenas for submarine warfare in the Second World War. Its geography funneled shipping through confined waters where every route could be watched, every convoy stalked. Axis submarines, particularly Italian boats and German U-boats transferred to the region, preyed on Allied supply lines to North Africa. British submarines retaliated in kind, targeting Italian troopships and supply convoys that sustained Rommel's Afrika Korps. In these waters, battles were fought at close range, often within sight of land, with little room to maneuver or escape. Depth charges echoed across narrow straits, their shock waves bouncing between seabeds and surface, amplifying terror for crews below. For sailors, the Mediterranean became a cauldron, where every voyage risked annihilation from unseen predators. The air was hot, the seas deceptively calm, and beneath the waves death lurked with ruthless persistence. Submarines turned the region into a battlefield of attrition, where victories were counted in cargoes delivered or denied. And in this confined sea, both sides bled heavily for survival. The British Royal Navy's submarines, operating from bases in Malta and Alexandria, carried the burden of strangling Axis logistics. The island of Malta itself became a fortress of resistance, its survival dependent on convoys that ran the gauntlet of submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders. Submarines stationed there struck constantly, sinking Italian freighters laden with fuel, ammunition, and food bound for North Africa. Their successes starved Rommel's panzer divisions, leaving tanks without fuel and soldiers without rations in the deserts of Libya. Italian submarines, larger and more numerous than their British counterparts, often struggled with aggressive Allied escorts and poor coordination. Yet when supported by German U-boats, they inflicted sharp losses on convoys bound for Malta and Egypt. The seesaw battle was brutal, with victories measured not only in ships sunk, but in the fate of armies ashore. A single convoy's failure could tip the balance of campaigns, deciding whether Rommel advanced or Montgomery held firm. Submarines in the Mediterranean were more than weapons, they were arbiters of strategy, and their impact rippled across the deserts of North Africa. Conditions aboard submarines in the Mediterranean were among the harshest of the war. Unlike the cool, storm-tossed Atlantic, these waters baked crews in suffocating heat, with temperatures inside the hull often reaching unbearable extremes. Men worked shirtless, sweat dripping onto steel decks, while condensation soaked bunks and equipment alike. Food spoiled quickly, air grew foul, and tempers frayed under constant bombardment from escorts above. Patrols were short in distance but long in endurance, as submarines hid for days in shallow waters to avoid depth charges. Survivors spoke of the claustrophobia, the unending pressure, and the fear of never escaping a shallow grave beneath warm seas. Torpedoes, once fired, often revealed a submarine's position instantly, inviting merciless retaliation. The Mediterranean turned steel hulls into ovens, testing human endurance as much as tactical skill. For crews, every patrol was a battle against heat, thirst, and fear. And yet, despite these conditions, submariners endured, determined to strike again. Their war was as much against the sea as against the enemy. While the Mediterranean saw constant attrition, the Arctic convoys presented a different but equally harrowing struggle. These convoys, sailing from Britain and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, carried the lifeblood of Lend-Lease aid. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition were packed onto merchantmen, braving seas patrolled by U-boats and aircraft of the Luftwaffe. The journey took ships through the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, where storms lashed decks with ice and temperatures plunged to lethal lows. Crews hacked ice from hulls and rigging to keep ships from capsizing under the weight of frozen spray. U-boats lay in wait among fjords and pack ice, surfacing at night to unleash torpedoes into columns of vulnerable freighters. The convoys faced attack not only from submarines, but from German surface raiders like the Tirpitz and Scharnhorst. Every voyage to Russia was a gamble, with losses sometimes catastrophic, yet the supplies they carried were vital for the Red Army. In these frozen seas, the silent killers of the deep thrived, and the bravery of those who sailed the convoys became legend. One of the most infamous episodes was Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942, a disaster born of fear and miscalculation. Ordered to scatter after intelligence warned of a sortie by the battleship Tirpitz, the convoy lost its protective cohesion. U-boats and Luftwaffe aircraft descended upon the unprotected ships, sinking 24 out of 35 merchantmen. Survivors drifted for days in freezing seas, clinging to rafts as comrades slipped silently beneath the waves. The catastrophe shook Allied confidence, raising questions about leadership and strategy in Arctic waters. Yet lessons were learned, and subsequent convoys sailed with stronger escort protection and tighter coordination. U-boats still prowled relentlessly, but the balance shifted as escorts grew in strength and air patrols extended their reach. Convoy after convoy delivered supplies that kept Soviet factories running and armies equipped for offensives. Despite losses, the Arctic route endured, a testament to Allied determination and sacrifice. And the role of submarines in this theater ensured every voyage carried mortal risk. German U-boats in Arctic waters faced their own brutal challenges, often as dangerous as those endured by their prey. The cold pierced steel hulls, freezing condensation into sheets of ice and numbing men's hands as they worked. Batteries drained faster in the frigid conditions, forcing more frequent surfacing and increasing exposure to air patrols. Torpedo maintenance became a nightmare in freezing seas, with weapons sometimes failing to function after hours exposed to sub-zero temperatures. Crews wrapped themselves in layers of wool, yet still shivered uncontrollably as drafts crept through every seam. The northern seas offered no mercy. Storms scattered patrol lines, and ice floes threatened to crush hulls like toys. Yet Dönitz sent his boats north, determined to sever the flow of Allied supplies to Stalin's armies. The men who sailed these missions spoke of fear not only of death, but of cold itself, an enemy more relentless than depth charges. Many boats never returned, swallowed by storms or destroyed in icy silence. The Arctic tested submariners to their absolute limits, and many paid with their lives. For Allied sailors on the Arctic convoys, survival demanded both endurance and courage beyond measure. Watchstanders froze at their posts, eyes watering in icy winds, scanning horizons blurred by snow and sleet. When torpedoes struck, the freezing water gave men only minutes to live, their cries silenced by numbing seas. Yet they sailed again and again, driven by duty and the knowledge that their cargo was vital for Soviet resistance. Escorts fought ferociously, dropping depth charges into waters thick with ice, while braving attacks from aircraft and submarines alike. Survivors described decks coated in frozen blood, where the dead lay stiff in the cold until they could be buried at sea. Despite this, convoys pressed on, each success strengthening the bond between allies fighting on opposite ends of Europe. The Arctic convoys became a symbol of sacrifice, remembered long after the war as one of its harshest campaigns. For submariners and sailors alike, the frozen sea was an enemy as implacable as the Germans, and their endurance defined the theatre. The Mediterranean and Arctic campaigns revealed the extremes of submarine warfare, from the sweltering heat of narrow seas to the frozen hell of northern oceans. In both, submarines shaped the course of the wider war by striking at the arteries of supply. Merchantmen became targets not just of torpedoes, but of strategy itself, their survival determining whether armies advanced or collapsed. The sacrifices of crews, Axis and Allied alike, were measured not in tonnage sunk, but in the fates of entire campaigns. Malta's survival owed as much to British submarines as to its anti-aircraft guns. The Soviet Union's ability to hold the line in 1942 depended on convoys that slipped past U-boats and raiders in frozen seas. Submarines in these theaters did more than kill ships. They shaped the destiny of continents. The Mediterranean and Arctic were unforgiving battlegrounds where steel met sea in struggles of endurance and courage, and in those waters the silent war claimed its heaviest toll. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy commanded one of the most advanced and diverse submarine fleets in the world. Their boats ranged from small coastal craft to massive ocean-going giants, some capable of launching aircraft from watertight hangars. In theory, this arsenal could have strangled American supply lines across the Pacific, replicating the devastation German U-boats inflicted in the Atlantic. But Japanese naval doctrine was built not on commerce raiding, but on the pursuit of decisive fleet engagements. Submarines were trained to shadow enemy warships, reporting positions and striking in support of carrier task forces. This vision reflected Japan's strategic obsession with recreating a modern-day Tsushima, a single battle that would destroy America's navy in one stroke. As a result, Japan neglected the merchant fleet, leaving it vulnerable even as the US depended on vast networks of shipping. This doctrinal flaw would cripple their submarine campaign before it ever began, and it would cost them the war of endurance they were never prepared to fight. Japanese submarines themselves were engineering marvels, reflecting ambition as much as practicality. The I-class boats, some over 350 feet long, carried immense fuel reserves and could patrol across entire oceans. Several were equipped with hangars for float planes, enabling reconnaissance flights that scouted enemy anchorages and coastlines. One such mission flew over Pearl Harbor in 1942, photographing damage weeks after the attack and proving the concept's potential. Other boats were designed as cargo carriers, intended to resupply distant garrisons cut off by Allied advances. The most ambitious of all were the I-400 class submarines, the largest of the war, designed to launch bombers capable of striking the US mainland. These giants embodied Japan's fascination with bold technological leaps, even when strategy offered no clear role for them. Crews endured long patrols across the Pacific, facing the same hardships as their American counterparts, but with less reward. Their missions reflected brilliance in design, but failure in doctrine, and the gap between technology and strategy grew wider with every passing year. Early in the war, Japanese submarines achieved successes that hinted at what might have been. In the opening months, they struck American warships with deadly accuracy, sinking the aircraft carrier Wasp and damaging others. They operated off Australia's coast, attacking shipping near Sydney, and even penetrated the Indian Ocean, sinking British and Dutch vessels. Their range allowed them to patrol far from home, and their commanders demonstrated skill in both navigation and attack. Yet these victories were limited to warships and isolated raids, impressive but strategically insignificant. Unlike their German counterparts, Japanese submarines were not deployed in wolfpacks, and coordination between boats was minimal. Attacks on merchant convoys were rare, even though American logistics depended on thousands of ships ferrying supplies to Pacific islands. This neglect squandered an opportunity to cripple the United States at its most vulnerable moment, when it was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The silent service of Japan hunted boldly but without purpose, and without purpose, victories became meaningless. The doctrinal blindness was rooted in Japan's view of war as a contest between fleets, not economies. Naval leaders saw submarines as scouts and auxiliaries, tools to weaken enemy task forces before the decisive battle. Convoy warfare was dismissed as secondary, even dishonorable, compared to the clash of battleships and carriers. This mindset reflected both tradition and hubris, a refusal to acknowledge the industrial imbalance between Japan and America. By sparing US merchant shipping, Japan allowed the full weight of American industry to surge across the Pacific. Supplies, troops, and weapons flowed uninterrupted to Australia, the Philippines, and island staging grounds. Japanese submarines could have strangled these routes, forcing America to divert resources and delay offensives. Instead, they hovered around carrier task forces, waiting for rare opportunities that yielded little strategic gain. In effect, Japan's submarines fought the wrong war, and their potential to shape the Pacific campaign slipped away, wasted by flawed vision. As the war turned against Japan, submarines were increasingly redirected to missions of desperation. Many became supply boats carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to isolated island garrisons bypassed by American advances. Crews risked their lives to deliver rice and medicine to soldiers starving in jungles and caves, often under heavy attack from Allied aircraft and escorts. These missions were dangerous and thankless, consuming submarines in roles they were never designed to fill. Others were tasked with inserting commandos or conducting reconnaissance, roles that, while daring, had little effect on the broader war. Japan's most advanced submarines were thus wasted on errands of survival rather than decisive campaigns. Every boat used as a supply vessel was one less stalking American shipping lanes. By 1944, the submarine arm was a shadow of its former self, scattered and unfocused. Their missions reflected Japan's growing desperation, and their strategic irrelevance became undeniable. Despite the failures of doctrine, individual Japanese submarine crews fought with courage and skill. Commanders like Takatsu Kinashi of the I-19 achieved remarkable feats, sinking the carrier Wasp, a destroyer, and damaging 2 battleships with a single spread of torpedoes. Such moments demonstrated the lethality of Japan's boats when used aggressively and with precision. Yet for every success, there were months of fruitless patrols, wasted opportunities, and missions that ended in silence beneath the waves. Crews endured long patrols with dwindling morale, aware that their sacrifices were yielding little effect on the war's outcome. They watched as America's silent service destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, while their own efforts contributed little to defending it. Their courage could not overcome flawed orders and wasted potential. They fought bravely, but they fought in vain, and history remembers them as victims of a doctrine that denied them victory. By 1944 and 1945, Japan's submarine fleet was being annihilated, hunted by American destroyers, aircraft, and even submarines. Losses mounted, with entire patrols vanishing into the depths, victims of radar, sonar, and overwhelming Allied power. The once ambitious I-class giants were no match for hunter-killer groups that struck with precision and coordination. The grand vision of I-400 super submarines faded as they were captured before completing a single mission. Japan's failure to protect its shipping was catastrophic, as American submarines strangled the empire with ruthless efficiency. Factories closed for lack of resources, warships rusted in harbors for want of fuel, and civilians starved as rice convoys were sunk. Submarines that might have inflicted similar damage on America were gone, wasted in roles they were never meant to play. The silent service of Japan had been silenced by its own leaders' blindness, and by war's end, it was little more than a footnote to the greater disaster. The legacy of Japanese submarine warfare is one of ambition without vision, bravery without strategy, and potential without fulfillment. Their boats were among the most advanced of the war, yet their doctrine ensured they never reached their true potential. They struck warships with daring, but left the arteries of supply untouched, forfeiting the chance to cripple America when it was weakest. As the United States built strength and strangled Japan's economy, the submarine arm faded into irrelevance. Crews paid with their lives for a strategy that could never succeed. Historians still debate what might have been if Japan had embraced commerce warfare like Germany. But history records what was, not what could have been, and what was a failure that doomed the empire to isolation and starvation. In the end, Japan's submarines were silent not because of defeat at sea, but because of defeat in vision, and that silence echoes still across the Pacific. Beneath the waves of the Second World War, submarines waged their deadly campaigns with weapons that were both terrifying and deeply flawed. Chief among these tools was the torpedo, a self-propelled missile designed to slip unseen through water and explode against the hulls of ships. Its concept was simple, but in practice it combined engineering, chemistry, and timing into a weapon of immense complexity. Torpedoes carried warheads packed with TNT or torpex, the latter nearly 50% more powerful than conventional explosives. Propulsion came from compressed air, steam, or later electric motors, each with advantages in speed, range, and stealth. Guidance was primitive, relying on gyroscopes to keep the torpedo true to its course once fired. Accuracy depended heavily on the submarine commander's calculations, often made under pressure in seconds as escorts bore down. A single spread could decide the fate of a convoy, or just as often vanish into the sea without striking anything. The torpedo was both the sword and the gamble of the undersea war, and its failures could be as consequential as its successes. For the United States, the torpedo war began in disaster, hampered by one of the most infamous technical failures of the conflict. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon of American submarines, was plagued by a trifecta of fatal flaws. Depth control mechanisms sent torpedoes running far deeper than set, causing them to pass harmlessly under targets. Magnetic detonators, intended to explode beneath a ship's keel for maximum damage, misfired in unpredictable ways. Contact exploders, meant to detonate on impact, often failed when striking at certain angles. Submariners risked their lives stalking convoys, only to watch torpedoes bounce off hulls or explode prematurely. Reports flooded back to the Bureau of Ordnance, but officials dismissed them, blaming poor firing solutions and inexperienced commanders. It took nearly 2 years of bitter combat before exhaustive field tests exposed the truth. By then, countless opportunities had been squandered, and many lives lost for want of reliable weapons. The Mark 14's failures nearly crippled America's silent service, and only persistence and ingenuity redeemed it. German U-boats, by contrast, began the war with weapons that were feared for their reliability and lethality. The standard G7E electric torpedo was virtually weightless, leaving no telltale trail of bubbles on the surface. This made it deadly in night attacks, when merchant sailors saw only explosions and flames without warning. Its drawback was limited range and slower speed, but its stealth outweighed those disadvantages in Wolfpack tactics. Germany also employed the G7, a steam-powered torpedo, faster and longer ranged, but marked by a visible wake that betrayed its path. As the war advanced, German engineers introduced acoustic homing torpedoes, known as T5 Zahn-König, designed to follow the sound of propellers. These posed a grave threat to escorts, which were suddenly vulnerable to weapons they could not easily evade. Countermeasures like the Foxer noisemaker eventually reduced their effectiveness, but the shock of their introduction was profound. German torpedoes reflected the ingenuity of a nation fighting against industrial odds, and they remained among the most feared weapons of the sea. The British, though primarily focused on anti-submarine measures, fielded torpedoes that served their submarines well in the Mediterranean and Arctic. Their standard 21-inch torpedoes were rugged and reliable, capable of sinking Italian convoys and even warships under daring commanders. British submarines often relied on stealthy approaches in confined waters, where a single successful strike could change the balance of a campaign. Mines, too, became a weapon of choice, laid covertly by submarines in harbors and shipping lanes. These mines, triggered by contact or magnetic influence, turned entire stretches of water into invisible minefields of death. Italian and German vessels found themselves trapped or destroyed without ever seeing their attacker. In the cold waters of the Arctic, torpedoes often struggled with freezing conditions, but British crews adapted with ingenuity. The reliability of their weapons made every patrol more decisive, even if numbers were limited compared to their German and American counterparts. British submarines did not always enjoy numerical superiority, but their weapons ensured their strikes counted when opportunity came. Japan, too, brought innovation to the undersea war, though, like its doctrine, its weapons often reflected ambition more than utility. Their most famous weapon, the Type 95 torpedo, was derived from the long lance used by surface ships, powered by pure oxygen for extraordinary range and speed. It was the fastest torpedo of the war, capable of outrunning many escorts and striking from ranges no enemy expected. Carried by submarines as well as destroyers, it proved deadly in early encounters, sinking carriers and cruisers with devastating results. Japanese engineers also experimented with manned torpedoes, the chiton, which turned desperate young volunteers into suicide weapons. These human-guided bombs reflected the extremity of Japan's situation, where technology could not match the industrial might of the Allies. Though occasionally successful, they were strategically insignificant, costing more lives than they saved. Japan's torpedo arsenal was a mix of brilliance and futility, like much of its submarine doctrine, and while feared, it never shifted the balance of the war. Mines represented another silent and indiscriminate killer, laid in staggering numbers across the world's seas. Submarines served as mine layers, slipping into enemy waters to drop their deadly cargo in harbors, channels, and convoy routes. Germany laid thousands of mines in British approaches, forcing escorts to sweep constantly and delaying shipping. The United States and Britain did the same against Japan, mining ports and shipping lanes with devastating effect. Mines sank merchantmen, tankers, and even warships, often with no warning beyond a sudden explosion and column of water. For crews, the terror lay in the invisibility of the threat, a constant reminder that death could come from beneath at any moment. Mines required no fuel, no operator, and no maintenance once deployed, making them a cost-effective weapon of attrition. Survivors spoke of the horror of ships breaking apart without enemy contact, their killers hidden beneath the sea. Mines lacked the drama of torpedoes, but their impact was no less decisive, and in some theaters they were the deadliest weapon of all. The evolution of submarine weapons during the war was a relentless cycle of innovation and countermeasure. Acoustic torpedoes gave way to noisemaker decoys, while magnetic mines inspired degaussing techniques to neutralize their triggers. Each new weapon sparked a response, forcing adversaries into constant adaptation. Submariners had to master not only tactics, but the quirks of their own flawed armaments, calculating risks as carefully as firing solutions. Many commanders grew superstitious, distrusting their weapons as much as their enemies, and relying on experience to compensate for sailors on the receiving end. The sound of a torpedo's approach, or the rumor of mines, struck terror into every voyage. Weapons of the deep were psychological as well as physical, shaping morale as much as strategy. The undersea war became a duel of wits, science, and endurance, fought with machines that were both ingenious and imperfect, and it left no certainty except that death could strike at any time. In the end, torpedoes and mines defined the submarine war as much as the boats that carried them. They were the invisible assassins of the sea, unseen until the moment of impact, when steel ripped apart and lives were lost in an instant. Technical flaws cost victories and extended wars, but ingenuity and persistence ultimately forged weapons of terrifying efficiency. The submarine was only as deadly as the armament it carried, and by 1945, these weapons had reshaped the world's oceans into killing fields. Torpedoes had sent carriers, battleships, and thousands of merchantmen to the bottom. Mines had choked harbors, crippled convoys, and starved nations into submission. For submariners, these weapons were both lifelines and curses, capable of betraying them as often as saving them. For sailors at sea, they were nightmares made real, the lurking killers no lookout could ever spot in time. The war beneath the waves was a war of machines, chemistry, and cold calculation, and its weapons remained symbols of silent, sudden death. Submarine warfare was a campaign of shadows, fought by men who lived daily with the knowledge that death might come without warning. Unlike soldiers on land or sailors on surface ships, submariners had no escape once the hull was breached. A single well-placed depth charge or torpedo could seal their fate, entombing entire crews in steel coffins beneath the sea. The cramped quarters, recycled air, and constant strain of silence forged an existence unlike any other branch of service. Men joked grimly that submariners wore their graves on their backs, carrying their tombs wherever they went. The human cost of this silent service was staggering, with losses proportionally higher than almost any other unit in the war. German U-boat crews suffered the worst, with over 70% of their men never returning home. American submariners, though ultimately successful, also endured the highest casualty rate of any U.S. branch, nearly 1 in 5 lost. Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union paid similar tolls, their boats vanishing without trace in every ocean. For the men who volunteered, the sea was both battlefield and executioner, and few escaped its grip unscathed. The greatest terror of the submarine war came not from torpedoes launched, but from depth charges falling from above. Escorts, alerted by sonar or chance sightings, unleashed patterns of explosives designed to encircle and crush their prey. The explosions reverberated through the water, slamming into hulls with concussive force that rattled every bolt and seam. Inside, men were thrown from bunks, gauges shattered, and lights flickered as pipes ruptured and water sprayed across compartments. The sound was described as a metallic hammer beating against the skull, unrelenting and suffocating in its violence. Crews sat in silence, unable to fight back, enduring the bombardment with clenched fists and whispered prayers. Every ping of sonar was a countdown to another detonation, another test of steel and nerves. Survivors often spoke of time slowing, each second stretched into eternity as they waited for the next blast. Some submariners lost their sanity under these conditions, the strain too much for fragile minds. Others emerged hardened, carrying scars that never healed, and for many, the silence that followed was permanent. Life inside a submarine was already a trial of endurance, even without enemy action. Air grew thick with carbon dioxide, stale with sweat, fuel oil, and cooking smells, suffocating men in a constant haze. Water was rationed, leaving sailors unwashed for weeks, their skin caked with grime and salt. Bunks were shared in shifts, a system called hot bunking, where one man's rest began as another's duty ended. Privacy was non-existent, conversations whispered in narrow passageways that reeked of diesel and humanity. Heat suffocated crews in the tropics, while in Arctic patrols the cold froze condensation into sheets of ice on bulkheads. Rats sometimes stowed away with provisions, gnawing at the meager supplies, while men looked on with bitter humor. Noise was constant, engines roaring on the surface, silence broken only by creaks and groans when submerged. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by the knowledge that discovery meant death with no chance of rescue. The submarine was both a weapon and a prison, and those who served inside bore its marks forever. The losses themselves tell a story of sacrifice written in statistics and sorrow. Germany launched nearly 1,100 U-boats, of which 784 were destroyed during the war, taking 30,000 men to their graves. The United States lost 52 submarines in the Pacific, with 3,500 crewmen killed in action. Britain's Royal Navy saw 74 submarines vanish in combat, with thousands of sailors lost in the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Arctic. Japan's losses were equally grim, with over 130 submarines destroyed and most of their crews perishing in silence. Soviet submariners, often overlooked in the broader narrative, lost over 100 boats in freezing Arctic and Baltic waters. Each sunken submarine represented not just a vessel but an entire community of men, families, and stories extinguished in an instant. Letters home stopped without explanation, their senders buried forever beneath the sea. Families often waited months before official confirmation arrived, clinging to hope long after reality had claimed their loved ones. The ocean was merciless in keeping its secrets, and it became the largest graveyard of the war. Psychological strain gnawed at submarine crews as relentlessly as the enemy above. Days submerged without surfacing created a suffocating sense of timelessness, where men lost track of day and night. The constant knowledge that one mistake could mean annihilation weighed heavily on commanders, whose decisions carried the lives of dozens. Submariners learned to suppress fear, turning terror into routines, checking gauges, loading torpedoes, scanning periscopes, as if repetition could ward off death. Yet nightmares were common, and breakdowns inevitable, with some men collapsing under the pressure of endless patrols. Anxiety manifested in physical ways, with ulcers, tremors, and insomnia spreading through crews like contagion. The silence between depth charge runs was almost worse than the explosions, as men listened for the telltale pings of sonar and imagined death creeping closer. Every creak of the hull at depth reminded them they lived in a fragile shell, inches away from crushing pressure. Camaraderie offered some relief, the bond of shared survival giving meaning to their suffering. But even the closest friendships could not erase the dread. Submarine life was survival lived on borrowed time. Stories of survival highlight both the horror and resilience of those who served beneath the waves. Men trapped in sunken boats sometimes survived for hours or even days, rationing air and tapping futile SOS messages against hulls. In rare cases, a handful escaped through emergency hatches, rising painfully through freezing water with lungs near bursting. Others fought fires and flooding in vain, struggling against smoke and darkness until silence claimed them. Survivors of destroyed boats often endured long interrogations as prisoners of war, carrying the trauma of their ordeal into captivity. Those who returned from successful patrols were hailed as heroes, yet carried unseen scars from what they had endured. Families noticed the haunted eyes, the sudden silences, the restless nights of men who could never fully leave the deep behind. Submariners rarely spoke openly of their experiences, bound by secrecy and the weight of memory. Their courage was measured not only in victories, but in endurance. They survived what few could imagine, and their stories remain etched in silence. The cost of submarine warfare was also felt by those who opposed them, for escorts and merchantmen endured equal terror in their defense. Convoy sailors lived with the knowledge that beneath them lurked unseen predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Depth charge crews labored frantically to destroy enemies they could not see, while fearing that torpedoes might already be on their way. The duel between escorts and submarines was intimate, fought at ranges measured in yards, each side straining to outlast the other. For the men dropping depth charges, there was no guarantee of success, only the hope of survival for their convoys. For the submariners below, there was no retreat, only endurance until the sea itself decided their fate. Both sides bore the weight of lives riding on their actions, thousands of tons of steel and human souls depending on their vigilance. The sea consumed them equally, without mercy or distinction. Submarine warfare was a contest of nerves as much as machines, and its victims stretched across every navy and nation. The human cost beneath the waves is perhaps the most sobering legacy of submarine warfare in the Second World War. Statistics alone cannot capture the claustrophobic dread of waiting in silence as depth charges fall, nor the grief of families who never saw their sons return. The submariners of every nation entered a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where courage meant enduring fear day after day. Their sacrifices reshaped the war, strangling supply lines, crippling navies, and deciding campaigns across oceans. But victory carried no shield against loss, and even the triumphant paid with blood and memory. The ocean holds their graves still, scattered across the globe in silent testimony. Ships pass above them unaware, their routes secured by the men who never returned. The legacy of these crews lies not only in tonnage sunk or battles won, but in the endurance of human spirit under impossible pressure. Submarine warfare was not only a battle of machines, it was a crucible of humanity tested to its breaking point, and its cost will never be forgotten. By 1943, the Allies realized that defending convoys was not enough to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Protection saved ships, but to truly break the U-boat menace, the hunters themselves had to be hunted. The solution was the creation of hunter-killer groups, task forces designed not to escort, but to roam the seas in search of submarines. At their heart were escort carriers, small and relatively slow compared to fleet carriers, but invaluable in their role. These carriers carried a handful of Wildcats, Avengers or Swordfish aircraft, each armed with depth charges, bombs and radar. Flanking them were destroyers and destroyer escorts, agile warships bristling with sonar, radar, and newly developed Hedgehog mortars. Together these groups were not bound to a convoy's speed or route, but could pursue intelligence leads and intercept wolfpacks. They turned the Atlantic into a battlefield where submarines were stalked day and night. For the first time the predators found themselves relentlessly pursued, and the hunters of the deep began to know fear. The escort carrier was the game changer, extending the Allies' reach into the once unguarded black pit of the mid-Atlantic. Converted from merchant hulls or built on smaller designs, they could not match the speed of fleet carriers, but they did not need to. Their mission was simple: provide eyes and striking power wherever convoys or patrol zones demanded. Aircraft equipped with radar swept vast expanses of ocean, detecting submarines on the surface even under cover of night. Once sighted, Avengers or Swordfish swooped low, dropping depth charges with pinpoint precision. Destroyers then closed in, guided by sonar, ready to pound the depths, until silence replaced the sonar echoes. The synergy between air and sea was devastating, denying submarines the freedom of movement they once enjoyed. What had been open ocean hunting grounds became traps, covered by constant aerial patrols. U-boat crews dreaded the whine of aircraft engines, a sound that meant death could come in minutes, and the hunters of the surface now had wings. Destroyer escorts formed the teeth of these hunter-killer groups, their smaller size and speed making them perfectly suited to anti-submarine warfare. Built in huge numbers by American shipyards, these vessels carried sonar, depth charges, and Hedgehog projectors as their primary armament. Hedgehogs revolutionized attacks by firing ahead of the ship, detonating only on contact and giving no warning to submariners below. Unlike depth charges, which shook hulls and forced boats deeper, Hedgehogs could kill instantly, breaching steel with terrifying efficiency. Destroyer crews honed their skills in coordinated attacks, circling a sonar contact and pounding it with relentless barrages. Long chases sometimes lasted hours, forcing submarines to drain their batteries until they had no choice but to surface or die. When submarines broke the surface, destroyer gunners opened fire, cutting down conning towers with streams of shells. Many of these duels ended with submariners abandoning ship into oil-slicked seas, their ordeal over but their war lost. The destroyers had become executioners of the deep, and their precision turned the tide of the campaign. The hunter-killer groups were directed by intelligence as much as instinct, relying heavily on ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park. Enigma messages revealed wolfpack positions, patrol lines, and rendezvous points, guiding carriers and destroyers toward their prey. Radio direction finding, or huff-duff, triangulated signals to pinpoint U-boat transmissions within miles. Air patrols then swept the target areas, forcing submarines to dive, where escorts were waiting with sonar to take over the chase. It was a symphony of coordination, combining technology, code breaking, and sheer persistence. The Germans never fully grasped how their movements were anticipated with such uncanny accuracy. Many commanders believed they faced chance encounters or invisible aerial scouts, never suspecting their own encrypted messages betrayed them. Hunter-killer groups thrived on this information, turning the vast ocean into a battlefield mapped in secret. For Allied crews, the satisfaction was immense, knowing each success was guided by hidden hands ashore. The war had become one of information as much as steel, and in this war, the Allies had the advantage. The results of these hunter-killer groups were dramatic, bleeding the U-boat arm dry at a pace it could not sustain. In 1943 alone, German submarines suffered losses at levels that even Dönitz admitted were catastrophic. Groups centered around escort carriers like USS Bogue and USS Card destroyed dozens of U-boats in a matter of months. British hunter-killer groups operating from carriers like HMS Vindex and HMS Tracker did the same, sweeping the northern approaches to Britain. Some groups sank multiple U-boats in a single operation, ambushing wolfpacks that never even sighted a convoy. German sailors described the shock of being hunted across days, never allowed to surface long enough to recharge. Losses became so severe that Dönitz was forced to withdraw his boats temporarily from the North Atlantic, conceding defeat in a theatre he had once dominated. Each sinking was another nail in the coffin of Germany's submarine war, and the hunter-killer groups delivered them relentlessly. For the crews of these Allied task forces, the work was relentless, exhausting, and often deadly. Aircraft crews flew long patrols over featureless seas, eyes straining for periscopes or wakes, nerves taut with expectation. Destroyer crews endured endless hours on sonar watches, listening for faint echoes that might mean life or death. Victories were celebrated, but always tempered by the knowledge that submarines could still strike back with torpedoes. Many hunter-killer ships were sunk themselves, victims of the very predators they hunted, proving the duel was never one-sided. Yet morale was high, driven by the knowledge that their actions saved thousands of merchant sailors. Survivors from torpedoed ships cheered when they saw escort carriers or destroyers, knowing these hunters meant protection as well as vengeance. Crews grew fiercely bonded, united by the shared tension of life in the hunt. Success was measured not in tonnage but in safety delivered, and every U-boat sunk was another convoy spared from annihilation. For the U-boat crews, the hunter-killer groups represented a nightmare that stripped them of initiative and hope. Patrols that once promised glory now carried overwhelming risk, with death lurking in every quadrant of the sea. Many boats were destroyed without ever sighting a convoy, hunted down in isolation by aircraft and escorts. Survivors spoke of the terror of constant pursuit, the sense that the ocean itself had turned against them. Stories spread of boats chased for days, depth charges rolling in patterns that never ceased, leaving crews broken before the final strike. The myth of the invincible U-boat collapsed, replaced by grim resignation as losses mounted. Even the most decorated commanders confessed despair, their skill useless against overwhelming Allied coordination. By 1944, the hunter-killer groups had broken the back of the U-boat fleet. The hunters had become the hunted, and the silent war beneath the waves was tilting inexorably toward Allied victory. The creation of hunter-killer groups was the culmination of years of adaptation, turning the tide of the longest battle of the war. They represented the fusion of intelligence, technology, and industrial power, wielded with ruthless precision against Germany's undersea arm. Escort carriers gave wings to convoys, destroyers gave teeth to the pursuit, and Ultra gave the Allies foresight their enemy lacked. Together, they transformed the Atlantic from a graveyard of merchantmen into a killing ground for U-boats. The hunter-killer groups were not glamorous, but they were decisive, quietly ensuring that supplies reached Britain, Russia, and the invasion forces that would liberate Europe. In their wake lay wrecks scattered across the ocean floor, silent monuments to the men who fought and died in the duel of hunters. The struggle was brutal, but it ensured the Atlantic lifeline was never severed again. The silent killers of the sea had met their match, and the balance of power beneath the waves had been permanently reversed. In January 1942, scarcely a month after Pearl Harbor, Germany unleashed one of the most audacious submarine campaigns of the war. Known as Operation Parkenschlag or Drumbeat, it sent U-boats directly to the American coast to exploit an unprepared and overconfident enemy. Admiral Karl Donitz believed the United States was unready for war at sea, and his instincts were correct. Coastal defenses were minimal, convoys non-existent, and shipping lanes ran close to shorelines illuminated by city lights. To U-boat commanders, the American seaboard seemed like a stage set for slaughter. German submarines prowled boldly within sight of skyscrapers, their periscopes watching ships silhouetted against the glow of New York and Miami. The war had come to America's doorstep, and its merchant fleet would pay the price. The hunters had crossed the ocean, and they found their prey waiting in plain sight. The first wave of Drumbeat included only 5 U-boats, but their impact was catastrophic. These boats, many Type 9 long-range submarines, had the endurance to cross the Atlantic, strike and return with relative ease. Commanders like Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 became infamous for their daring patrols along the eastern seaboard. Within days, tankers, freighters, and passenger liners were aflame off Cape Hatteras, their wrecks visible from shore. Survivors clung to lifeboats as Americans on beaches watched oil fires blaze across the horizon. In less than 6 months, over 400 ships were sunk along the US coast, representing more than 2 million tons of shipping. The cost in lives was equally staggering, with thousands of sailors drowned, burned, or left adrift. German crews called it their second happy time, recalling the early victories in the Atlantic. For them, the waters off America were a paradise of targets, and for the United States, it was a nightmare of unpreparedness. The vulnerability of American shipping lay in the absence of even the most basic protective measures. Cities refused to dim their lights, fearing the economic and social disruption of blackouts. Ships sailed independently instead of in convoys, believing escorts were unnecessary so close to home. The result was a deadly contrast: illuminated coastlines and darkened seas, with tankers outlined perfectly for U-boat periscopes. American naval leaders were slow to react, dismissing warnings from Britain and underestimating the scale of the threat. By the time convoys were belatedly organized along the East Coast, hundreds of ships had already been lost. U-boat captains operated with impunity, sometimes surfacing to fire deck guns at merchantmen within sight of terrified civilians. The complacency of America's early months in the war proved fatal to countless sailors, and it gave Germany one of its most lopsided campaigns of destruction. The waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean soon joined the slaughter, as U-boats expanded their reach southward. Tankers carrying oil from Texas and Venezuela were prime targets, their destruction crippling fuel supplies vital to the Allied war effort. In the Caribbean, the narrow passages between islands funneled ships into easy hunting grounds. U-boats stalked the Florida Straits, the Windward Passage, and the approaches to Trinidad, sinking vessels with ruthless efficiency. Resorts and fishing towns awoke to find wreckage washing ashore, survivors stumbling onto beaches with stories of fire and death. German propaganda boasted that submarines were striking deep in America's backyard, spreading fear across the hemisphere. Even the Panama Canal was considered a potential target, though heavily defended against intrusion. The campaign extended the war into waters once thought secure, forcing the US Navy to stretch its resources across vast new theaters, and for months the destruction went unanswered. The human toll of Operation Drumbeat was felt not only at sea, but in the homes and harbors of America. Newspapers carried headlines of ships lost within sight of major cities, stirring panic among coastal populations. Fishermen and merchant sailors spoke of burning oil slicks that covered miles of ocean, swallowing men in flames and choking survivors with fumes. Families waited anxiously for news of husbands, sons, and brothers whose ships had sailed but never returned. Survivors packed lifeboats and life rafts, often drifting for days before rescue, recounting horrors of explosions, sharks, and exposure. Some were rescued by passing freighters, others by Coast Guard patrols hastily organized to respond to the crisis. Ports like Norfolk, Miami, and New Orleans became hubs of grief, their piers crowded with the shell-shocked survivors of torpedoed ships. The scale of suffering forced the US Navy to acknowledge the crisis, and it revealed that America's entry into the war had come at a staggering price. For the German crews, Operation Drumbeat was a campaign of unprecedented success and confidence. Commanders described the ease of their patrols with astonishment, marveling at the abundance of targets and the lack of opposition. Some captains logged more sinkings in a single patrol than others achieved in entire careers. Crew morale soared, bolstered by the belief that they were striking a crippling blow to America's war effort. Decorations and promotions followed, as Dunets celebrated their triumphs and pressed for more boats to join the campaign. Yet, even as they reveled in success, the risks of overconfidence loomed. American patrol aircraft began extending their range, while destroyers and corvettes arrived from Britain to bolster defenses. The tide of destruction could not last forever, and the hunters who had once ruled unchallenged would soon find the seas turning against them. By mid-1942, the United States finally responded with measures that closed the window of German advantage. Convoy systems were implemented along the East Coast, grouping merchantmen under the protection of escorts. Coastal blackouts dimmed the cities, denying U-boats the easy silhouettes they had once exploited. Aircraft patrols expanded, with blimps, cataliners, and Navy bombers scouring shipping lanes for signs of periscopes or wakes. Sonar-equipped destroyers hunted the submarines more aggressively, forcing them to dive and draining their endurance. The introduction of hunter-killer groups in American waters brought the lessons of the Atlantic home. Losses of merchant ships began to decline, while U-boat casualties steadily rose. The second happy time was ending, its window of devastation closing as swiftly as it had opened. For the Germans, the campaign had been lucrative but temporary, and for America, it was a bitter lesson bought with blood. The legacy of Operation Drumbeat is one of both devastation and awakening. In 6 months, Germany had inflicted losses that shocked the world, sinking more tonnage off America's coast than in any comparable period of the war. The campaign revealed the vulnerability of even the most powerful nation when unprepared for modern submarine warfare. Yet it also galvanized the United States into action, accelerating the development of convoys, escorts, and coastal defenses. What began as a catastrophe became a turning point, transforming inexperience into hardened resolve. The Atlantic would no longer be a haven for the hunters, but a battlefield where they would be pursued without rest. Operation Drumbeat stands as a reminder that the sea is unforgiving to the complacent. It exposed America's weakness, but it also revealed its capacity to adapt, and in that adaptation lay the seeds of ultimate victory. The hunters had struck boldly, but in doing so, they awakened a giant that would not sleep again. Beneath the vast scope of tonnage wars and wolfpack battles lay a quieter, stranger side of submarine warfare. Submarines were not only killers of ships, but also instruments of secrecy, stealth, and daring. They became transporters of commandos, smugglers of critical supplies, and eyes of reconnaissance in enemy waters. These missions lacked the drama of torpedo strikes, but carried their own unique peril, demanding precision and courage in equal measure. To surface in darkness on a hostile coast, to open hatches under the threat of enemy patrols, was as dangerous as any convoy battle. Yet these operations often had strategic consequences far greater than their size suggested. From the Pacific Islands to the coasts of France, submarines slipped through unseen gaps to deliver men and material. In these shadows, wars were shaped not only by destruction but by infiltration, and the submarine became a vessel of secrets as much as death. In the Pacific, American submarines often carried out daring missions beyond their patrol orders. They ferried marine reconnaissance teams onto enemy-held islands, slipping ashore in rubber boats to scout defenses ahead of invasions. Some carried coast watchers, loyal civilians and Allied officers who reported Japanese ship movements by radio from remote jungles. Submarines also evacuated downed pilots and stranded soldiers, surfacing at night to take aboard men who thought themselves abandoned. These rescues often took place under enemy air patrols, forcing submariners to risk exposure for the lives of a handful of men. Cargo missions were equally vital, delivering ammunition and medical supplies to isolated garrisons across the Pacific. The ability of submarines to appear unexpectedly gave commanders a tool of flexibility unmatched by any other vessel. Their contribution to intelligence and morale was immense, far outweighing the tonnage they carried, and in their stealth they gave hope to those cut off by the tides of war. German U-boats, too, embraced covert missions, though often with grander ambitions. They landed saboteurs on the shores of America and Canada, hoping to ignite panic and disruption behind enemy lines. Operation Pastorius in 1942 saw 8 German agents landed by U-boat on Long Island and in Florida, equipped with explosives and cash. Their mission was to destroy factories, bridges, and railways, but the operation collapsed when 2 surrendered to the FBI. Other U-boats attempted to deliver advanced technology and blueprints to Japan, carrying crates of mercury, rubber, and even uranium oxide across the oceans. These Yanagi missions, though few, revealed the global reach of submarine operations. U-boats also supplied the Afrika Korps, delivering fuel and equipment across the Mediterranean despite relentless Allied pursuit. Each mission was a gamble, with the submarine's survival tied to the secrecy of its cargo. When successful, they demonstrated the submarine's versatility. When they failed, the consequences were often fatal, and in either case the risks were staggering. The British Royal Navy employed submarines as clandestine ferries for their elite commandos. Boats operating out of Malta or Scotland slipped special operations units ashore on the coasts of occupied Europe. From the fjords of Norway to the beaches of Crete, submarines delivered saboteurs who struck at rail lines, depots, and communications hubs. Some carried agents of the Special Operations Executive, whose missions included gathering intelligence and fostering resistance movements. These operations required precise navigation, surfacing in shallow waters, often within sight of enemy searchlights. Commanders timed their approaches to the minute, releasing small teams who vanished into the night with weapons and radios. Many never returned, their missions ending in capture or death, but the intelligence they provided was priceless. Submarines thus became lifelines for underground movements, linking occupied nations to Britain's war effort. They were vessels of hope as much as of war, and their crews took pride in these secret roles. The Japanese submarine fleet carried out special missions that reflected both ingenuity and desperation. Early in the war, they launched reconnaissance floatplanes from submarines, photographing Pearl Harbor and Sydney with astonishing boldness. In 1942, submarines shelled the American coast at Santa Barbara, firing from deck guns in a symbolic act of psychological warfare. They also attempted to deliver reinforcements and supplies to garrisons trapped by Allied advances, missions that often ended in disaster. As the tide turned, Japan embraced suicide weapons like the chitin human torpedo, deploying them from submarines in a last attempt to reverse defeat. These missions killed many young volunteers, but achieved little strategic result, embodying the futility of Japan's late-war efforts. Yet their submarines also carried diplomats, spies, and even rare cargoes across oceans, seeking to sustain alliances with Germany. The range of roles they attempted reflected the versatility of the undersea arm, but it also revealed the growing desperation of an empire cut off by sea, and submarines became the last fragile link to survival. Submarines were also powerful tools of deception and diversion, their very presence altering enemy strategy. A single report of a submarine sighting could reroute entire convoys, delay invasions, or force escorts into wild chases. Commanders often exaggerated their positions, using radio transmissions to lure enemies into traps or away from vital shipping lanes. German U-boats, for example, threatened the invasion of North Africa by suggesting wolfpacks lurked nearby, forcing the Allies to divert destroyers from amphibious forces. In the Pacific, Japanese submarines shadowed carrier groups, feeding intelligence that sometimes led to deadly ambushes. The submarine's stealth made it as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. Its unseen presence shaped decisions at the highest levels of command. And in war, perception could be as powerful as reality. The risks of special missions often outweighed their tangible gains, but their impact was felt in ways difficult to measure. Every commando inserted by submarine carried the potential to derail an enemy's plan or reveal secrets worth more than ships sunk. Every supply run to an isolated garrison sustained defenders long enough to tie down enemy forces. Every rescued pilot or soldier returned valuable experience and morale to the fight. Submarine captains knew these missions placed them in greater danger than traditional patrols, but many accepted the burden with pride. Their boats were fragile lifelines, threading through hostile seas for goals unseen by the public. The stories of these operations rarely made headlines, but lived on in the memories of those who carried them out. They added another layer to the submarine's reputation as a weapon of shadows, and they proved that the war beneath the waves was not fought by torpedoes alone. In the grand narrative of submarine warfare, special missions were often overlooked, overshadowed by the tonnage battles of the Atlantic and Pacific. Yet they represented the versatility and unpredictability of undersea warfare, where a single boat could deliver death, supplies, or secrets with equal efficiency. Submarines extended the reach of nations into enemy harbors, beaches, and coastlines, carrying with them men and cargoes that could change the course of campaigns. They embodied the clandestine nature of total war, where stealth and secrecy were as vital as firepower. For the men who undertook these missions, the risks were enormous, but so too was the sense of purpose. The submarine was not just a predator, but a vessel of possibilities, a tool that could alter the war in unexpected ways. These missions added depth to the silent service's role, showing it to be more than just a killer of ships. They were the shadow hand of strategy, and their legacy endures as proof of the submarine's many faces. By 1944, the once feared U-boat arm was a shadow of its former self, ground down by relentless Allied pressure and catastrophic losses. The wolfpacks that had terrorized the Atlantic were reduced to scattered patrols, often too few and too late to make an impact. Air supremacy, once limited to coastal waters, now stretched across the entire ocean, with long-range liberators and escort carriers closing every gap. Convoys moved with confidence, their decks bristling with anti-submarine weapons, while hunter-killer groups roamed freely in search of prey. The sea, which had once been the U-boats' hunting ground, was now an arena of ambush where they were the quarry. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had staked Germany's naval hopes on his grey wolves, could only watch as his arm was bled white. His strategy had depended on massed strength, but by now only fragments remained, scattered across shrinking patrol areas. Every sortie risked annihilation, every mission carried a death sentence. The age of the U-boat as master of the Atlantic was over, and the hunters knew it. Losses mounted at a staggering rate, turning patrols into one-way voyages for thousands of German sailors. In 1944 alone, over 240 U-boats were destroyed, many without ever sighting an enemy ship. Allied radar detected them even at night, stripping away the protection of darkness that had once been their ally. High-frequency direction finding intercepted their radio transmissions, allowing escorts to converge within hours. Aircraft scoured the seas day and night, forcing submarines to dive constantly and draining their batteries before attacks could even begin. Once submerged, sonar-guided destroyers pursued them relentlessly, often for days until depth charges or hedgehogs brought the inevitable end. German crews spoke of despair, of leaving harbour knowing survival was unlikely and glory impossible. The survival rate of new recruits plummeted, with many lost on their first or second patrol. For every ship sunk, multiple U-boats were destroyed, reversing the grim arithmetic of the early war years. The sea had become a graveyard for Germany's silent service, and morale collapsed with every sinking. In response to this disaster, Dönitz pinned his hopes on technological salvation. The Type XX-1 U-boat, dubbed the Electro-boot, promised a revolution with faster submerged speeds, greater endurance, and advanced batteries. It could outrun escorts underwater, remain submerged for days, and fire with precision guided by modern sensors. Yet its arrival came too late, delayed by Allied bombing campaigns that crippled German industry and disrupted production lines. Only a handful were completed before the war's end, and fewer still reached operational status. The Type XX-3E, a smaller coastal design, saw limited action but could not change the strategic balance. German engineers also experimented with snorkels, allowing boats to run diesel engines while submerged, but the devices were crude and vulnerable to detection. These innovations revealed the ingenuity of German science, but also the futility of late-war desperation. By 1945, the Allies had built overwhelming superiority in every theatre. No amount of technology could reverse that tide, and the dream of a U-boat renaissance sank before it ever began. Meanwhile, the Atlantic War became a slaughterhouse for inexperienced crews rushed into service. Training, once rigorous, was shortened dramatically as Germany struggled to replace staggering losses. Young men barely out of adolescence were sent to sea under green commanders, their knowledge of survival tactics shallow at best. They faced veteran Allied escorts and aircraft who knew every trick, every maneuver of the undersea duel. Many boats never returned from their maiden voyages, their crews perishing without ever firing a torpedo. Survivors spoke of fear gripping these young men, of trembling hands on controls and eyes haunted by the certainty of death. For Donitz, this was a bitter reality, as he had once called his submariners an elite brotherhood. By 1944, they were a generation sacrificed in hopeless missions, their skill no match for overwhelming opposition. The U-boat service became the graveyard of Germany's youth, and each patrol deepened the tragedy of wasted lives. The impact on Germany's war effort was devastating, compounding the collapse already underway on land. Without U-boats to threaten the Atlantic, Allied shipping lanes became secure highways of supply. American factories poured tanks, aircraft, and ammunition across the ocean, building up forces for the invasions of France and Italy. Soviet Russia received Lend-Lease aid in unprecedented quantities, fueling offensives that rolled the Wehrmacht back across the Eastern Front. Britain's survival was no longer in question. Its people fed and its war machine supplied with steady regularity. What had once been a strategic weapon capable of strangling empires was reduced to an afterthought, unable to stop the flood of Allied power. Germany's navy, once proud of its daring undersea fleet, watched helplessly as the war slipped away. The collapse of the U-boat arm symbolized the broader collapse of Nazi Germany itself. A weapon built to decide the war had instead been broken by it, and the price was paid in tens of thousands of lives. For the submariners themselves, the final years were an ordeal of hopelessness and endurance. Patrols stretched into weeks of silence and fear, with crews expecting death at every sound of a sonar ping. The ocean that had once promised glory now felt like a coffin waiting to be sealed. Men wrote farewell letters before leaving port, some leaving their belongings behind with resigned certainty. Sailors spoke of dreams filled with explosions and drowning, of nightmares that mirrored their waking lives. Superstition grew, with men clinging to lucky charms or rituals to ward off inevitable fate. When boats were lost, their absence was often unremarked in Germany's censored newspapers, their crews erased without ceremony. Families waited in vain for letters that would never come, their silence as final as the ocean's embrace. For those who survived, the memories lingered as wounds that never healed, and for the fallen, the sea became their eternal grave. The Allies, meanwhile, pressed their advantage ruthlessly, determined to finish the undersea war. Hunter-killer groups patrolled aggressively, sinking submarines wherever they surfaced. Escort carriers launched aircraft that hunted across thousands of miles, ensuring no refuge remained for the U-boats. Mines blocked ports and approaches, trapping boats before they could even reach the Atlantic. Bases in France, once bustling with U-boat activity, were bombed relentlessly, forcing relocations that further weakened operations. Intelligence continued to intercept their movements, denying even the smallest element of surprise. By the spring of 1945, the U-boat fleet was effectively destroyed, with dozens surrendering at sea as Germany collapsed. Some captains scuttled their boats rather than hand them to the enemy, sending them to the depths with crews or without. Others limped back to port, their war over before it had begun. The final toll was staggering. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, more than 30,000 never returned. No other branch of service endured such a fate, and no other campaign ended with such finality. The collapse of the U-boat arm was more than a military defeat. It was the end of an era. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied shipping, became the highway of liberation, carrying armies to Normandy and supplies to starving Europe. Germany's grand gamble on undersea warfare had failed, undone by Allied adaptation, technology, and sheer industrial might. For Donitz, it was a personal tragedy, the death of the vision he had built across decades of service. For the men who perished, it was the ultimate sacrifice in a war that consumed them without mercy. The Wolfpacks, that once prowled with confidence now lay scattered wrecks across the ocean floor, monuments to ambition and futility. The Allies had wrested control of the seas, and with it, control of the war's outcome. Submarine warfare had shaped the conflict profoundly, but by 1945 its tide had ebbed away. The hunters had become the hunted, and the silence of their graves spoke louder than any victory ever could. As 1945 dawned, the U-boat fleet, once the terror of the Atlantic, embarked on its final desperate missions. The German Navy still clung to the belief that a handful of boats might slow the Allied tide, though hope had long since drained away. Submarines left their bases in Norway, France, and Germany itself, manned by crews who knew survival was unlikely. Their orders often bordered on suicidal strike at heavily guarded convoys, attack invasion fleets, or harass coastal shipping in waters thick with patrols. Many boats never cleared their harbors, destroyed by Allied aircraft before they reached the open sea. Those that did often found themselves hunted within days, tracked by sonar and radar with unrelenting precision. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, was now a trap from which few returned. Patrols ended not in victory, but in silence, their wrecks settling on the ocean floor. The war at sea had become a slow-motion execution, and the U-boat arm was paying its final price. Germany's most advanced submarines, the Type XX-73, represented a glimpse of what might have been: sleek, fast, and capable of extended submerged operations. They embodied a revolution in undersea warfare. Yet by the time they reached operational status, the war was already lost. Only a handful ever sailed patrols, and fewer still engaged the enemy. A few successes were recorded: an Allied freighter sunk here, a warship damaged there, but they were drops in the ocean compared to the flood of Allied power. Shipyards bombed by Allied aircraft could not produce them in sufficient numbers, and crews lacked the training to exploit their full potential. These wonder weapons had arrived years too late, their promise undone by the collapse of the Reich around them. For the men aboard, the sense of futility was inescapable, fighting with unmatched technology against impossible odds. They sailed knowing their missions were meaningless, their victories symbolic at best, and with each sinking, the curtain drew closer on Germany's naval war. As the Allies advanced across Europe, U-boat bases became targets of relentless bombing. The once impregnable pens in France and Germany shook under the weight of thousands of tons of explosives. Submarines trapped inside their fortified shelters were reduced to twisted wrecks, unable to escape or fight back. Crews stood helpless as their boats were buried under rubble or shattered in dry dock before ever leaving port. In Norway, where the last remnants of the fleet sheltered, preparations were made for desperate final missions into the North Atlantic. Yet even there, Allied air patrols and mines awaited them, sealing exits with deadly efficiency. The bases that had once launched wolfpacks by the dozen were now cemeteries of steel, lined with unfinished hulls and broken dreams. For the men who watched from shore, it was a bitter end to a service once filled with pride. The war had stripped them of power, of purpose, and finally of their vessels themselves. And soon it would strip them of surrender as well. The Japanese submarine fleet endured a parallel decline, equally marked by futility and sacrifice. Once a formidable arm of the Imperial Navy, it was reduced by 1945 to a desperate force of dwindling boats and desperate missions. Japanese submarines were increasingly tasked with suicide operations, launching chitin human torpedoes against Allied ships. Volunteers climbed into the cramped warheads, steering themselves to certain death for little gain. Other submarines were used for supply runs, attempting to bring food and ammunition to starving island garrisons already doomed to surrender. Losses mounted as American destroyers and aircraft, hardened by years of experience, destroyed these boats with clinical precision. By war's end, Japan had lost more than 130 submarines, with crews swallowed by the Pacific in hopeless missions. The Empire's undersea force, once boasting giants like the I-400 class, lay broken and scattered. Their legacy was one of innovation wasted on flawed strategy, and their final voyages became epitaphs of desperation. In the Atlantic, the Allies prepared for the end by tightening their grip on the collapsing U-boat fleet. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, over 150 submarines were still at sea, many unaware of the war's conclusion. Messages went out ordering them to surface, hoist black flags, and surrender to the nearest Allied ships. Some obeyed, rising out of the depths to hand over their boats and crews without resistance. Others chose defiance, scuttling their vessels rather than allow them to be captured. Explosions and plumes of oil marked their ends as crews abandoned ship into lifeboats, their duty fulfilled in destruction rather than surrender. In a few tragic cases, Allied warships continued to attack, unaware that peace had already been declared. The ocean became a strange place in those final days, half battlefield and half ceasefire, as submarines emerged like ghosts from the deep. Their war was over, but their fates remained as diverse as the men who commanded them. The Allies quickly realized the captured U-boats represented both danger and opportunity. Dozens were seized intact, their technology scrutinized by British, American, and Soviet engineers. The revolutionary designs of the Type XX-1 inspired a new generation of submarines, shaping Cold War fleets on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Yet the majority of surrendered U-boats were deemed too dangerous to remain afloat. In Operation Deadlight, more than 100 were towed into the North Atlantic and deliberately sunk. Depth charges, naval gunfire, and explosive charges consigned them to the depths, erasing the last remnants of Germany's once feared fleet. For Allied sailors, it was both a cleansing of the seas and a practical disposal of unwanted weapons. For German crews, it was a final indignity, watching their boats destroyed, not in battle, but in bureaucratic efficiency. The Atlantic became their grave once more, and the U-boat arm passed into history with silence. For the men who survived, surrender was both a relief and a humiliation. Prisoners of war were marched into camps, stripped of their commands and treated as relics of a lost cause. Many felt the weight of guilt, knowing their comrades lay dead beneath the sea while they lived on in captivity. Some clung to pride, remembering the courage and sacrifice of their fallen brothers despite the futility of their final campaigns. Others struggled to reconcile their loyalty to a lost life with the reality of defeat. In Allied hands, they became valuable sources of intelligence, their knowledge dissected to shape the submarine fleets of the future. Yet behind the interviews and interrogations lay broken men, haunted by years of fear and loss. They carried with them the silence of the deep, a silence no victory or surrender could erase. Their war had ended, but its shadows endured, and their legacy was written not in triumph, but in tragedy. The final voyages of submarines in World War II marked the closing chapter of a brutal, relentless conflict beneath the waves. From Germany's last, doomed patrols to Japan's desperate suicide missions, the undersea war ended not with victory, but with collapse. Boats that had once prowled with arrogance now lay at the bottom of the sea, or in Allied scrapyards, their menace extinguished. The surrender of these fleets symbolized the end of an era, where stealth and attrition had nearly brought empires to their knees. Yet it also heralded a new beginning, as their designs shaped the submarine warfare of the Cold War. For those who fought, the sea was both battlefield and graveyard, a place of courage, fear, and sacrifice beyond measure. Their war ended in surrender, but their story did not vanish with it. The silent killers of the sea left behind lessons written in steel and blood, and their memory endures, carried by the waves that still roll above their final resting places. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the oceans remained heavy with the wrecks of thousands of ships and submarines. Beneath those waters lay not only the dead, but also the lessons of the most extensive undersea conflict in history. Submarine warfare had proven itself as both a weapon of terror and a tool of decisive strategy. Germany's U-boats nearly starved Britain into collapse, while American submarines strangled Japan's maritime lifelines. The human cost was staggering, with tens of thousands of submariners entombed in steel coffins that would never surface again. Yet their sacrifice forced navies to rethink the very nature of naval combat. No longer could fleets be judged solely by the number of battleships or carriers they possessed. Submarines had altered the balance of power, proving that small, stealthy hunters could change the outcome of global war, and their shadow would loom over every navy that sailed in the decades to come. The post-war world inherited both the tragedy and the innovations of submarine warfare. The German Type XX-1 and Type XX-3, though too late to affect the outcome, revealed a vision of the future. Their streamlined hulls, powerful batteries, and snorkels inspired designs across Allied navies. The United States and Soviet Union seized captured boats, dismantling them piece by piece to study their secrets. From these blueprints emerged the first true underwater vessels, designed to operate submerged for weeks rather than hours. The age of the submarine as a surface ship that could dive was ending. In its place came the submarine as a true creature of the deep, built to vanish beneath the waves and remain there unseen. The Cold War would see this vision realized in steel and nuclear power, and the lessons of the Atlantic and Pacific became the foundation of an entirely new era. The Cold War transformed submarines from hunters of commerce into guardians of annihilation. Nuclear propulsion, pioneered by the USS Nautilus in 1955, gave boats unlimited range and endurance beneath the sea. Submarines no longer had to surface for air or fuel, disappearing into the ocean for months at a time. Alongside this revolution came the advent of the ballistic missile submarine, capable of launching nuclear warheads from hidden positions anywhere on the globe. The silent service now carried the power to destroy cities, nations, and civilizations. Where once submarines hunted merchantmen for survival, now they patrolled as instruments of deterrence, ensuring that war itself remained unthinkable. The oceans became battlefields of shadows once again, with American and Soviet boats playing cat and mouse across the depths. Yet the roots of this silent duel traced back to the lessons of 1939, 1945. The legacy of World War II's submariners echoed in every Cold War patrol, and their sacrifice underpinned the fragile peace of a nuclear world. But even as submarines became nuclear giants, the memory of their World War II role remained central to naval doctrine. Navies never forgot that the undersea war had been one of attrition, where numbers, endurance, and strategy mattered as much as technology. Convoys became standard practice, ensuring that no nation would again underestimate the vulnerability of unescorted shipping. Anti-submarine warfare evolved into a science, with sonar, helicopters, and specialized aircraft forming layered defenses across every ocean. Exercises simulated Wolfpack tactics, preparing fleets for enemies that might strike without warning. The Battle of the Atlantic became a case study in how intelligence, technology, and persistence could defeat even the most lethal predator. The Pacific Campaign showed the devastating power of submarines unleashed against supply lines. These lessons shaped not only naval strategy, but also national survival planning. The oceans were no longer secure by default, and every sailor knew that somewhere beneath the waves, danger might still be waiting. The image of the submarine also endured in the cultural memory of the war. Films, novels, and memoirs painted vivid pictures of life aboard these steel coffins. German veterans described the terror of depth-charge attacks, while Americans recalled the pride of strangling Japan's empire from below. The stories of heroism and sacrifice became part of the mythology of the war, immortalized in works like Das Boot and countless histories. Yet beneath the drama lay the reality of unimaginable loss, with submariners carrying the highest casualty rates of any branch. Their bravery was remembered in silence rather than parades, in memorials etched with names few civilians recognized. To the world, the submarine became a symbol of endurance, stealth, and sacrifice. It was the vessel of shadows, the killer unseen until it struck, and its image endured long after the warships of the surface had been scrapped. For the families of those who served, the legacy was personal, etched in grief as much as pride. Wives and children waited for sailors who never returned, their boats vanishing without trace into the deep. Letters stopped abruptly, photographs became final memories, and silence became the cruelest answer of all. In Germany, in Britain, in America, and in Japan, generations grew up with fathers and brothers buried beneath the sea. Monuments rose in coastal towns, their inscriptions lists of the lost, but the true graves lay scattered across oceans. Survivors carried their memories quietly, rarely speaking of the horrors they endured, haunted by the faces of comrades who never surfaced. The legacy of submarine warfare was not only technological or strategic, it was deeply human. It was the price of endurance in a war fought in silence, and it remains carved into the hearts of those left behind. In the decades after 1945, the oceans became both the stage of Cold War rivalry and the grave of wartime submariners. Allied and Axis wrecks lay side by side, silent testimonies to courage and futility alike. Divers exploring them today find frozen moments of history, boots by bunks, plates still stacked, gauges forever frozen at the last desperate depth. These relics remind us that the sea never releases its dead, but keeps them as witnesses to the struggles of men. For historians, these wrecks are archives of technology and bravery. For families, they are cemeteries that cannot be visited, sanctified by salt and silence. The ocean holds the memory of the undersea war with relentless permanence, and in its depths lies the legacy of sacrifice that defined it. The story of submarine warfare in World War II is thus more than a chronicle of ships sunk and tonnage lost. It is the tale of men who ventured into darkness, who lived in silence, and who fought wars few would ever see. It reshaped strategy, transformed technology, and revealed the immense cost of unseen conflict. Its lessons guided navies into the nuclear age, where submarines became arbiters of global survival. Its memory shaped culture, embedding the submarine as both predator and tomb, and its human cost ensured that silence itself became a symbol of sacrifice. The legacy of submarine warfare endures not only in fleets and strategies, but in the eternal whisper of the sea. Beneath every wave lies a reminder of what was endured, what was lost, and what was learned. The silent killers of the Second World War shaped the world that followed, and their echoes remain, carried forever in the depths.